Hello, everyone. Santir here, and it's time for me to finally record this Elden Ring review that I've been wanting to do for a while. Now that I have beaten the game 3 times, and a little bit of additional playthroughs as well, just to make sure I've seen things and been fairly thorough. So, I want to start just by I think it's really good to get an understanding of who somebody is when they're reviewing, because a lot of this, there's a lot of facts, and then there's my opinions on those facts, how I feel about them, what I think about them, and a lot of what this is going to be is me going into those opinions. And so I think it's really useful to know who I am as a person, as a gamer, what sort of things I like, just to be able to get a sense of where I'm coming from, because you might be very different from me. You might have very different tastes from me. And that might mean that you'll disagree with me a lot on certain points because your perspective is different. So I just want you to know where I'm coming from. So, what I like about games is I like being able to explore different playstyles, different variety. So some of my favorite games, Guild Wars 1, Magic the Gathering, they really have a lot of this ability to kind of customize what you're doing. Pokemon as well, where you can make a lot of different teams, really kind of explore what you're doing in a lot of different ways. I also like engaging systems, so I enjoy the combat of Souls to a certain degree. I enjoy the Middle Earth Shadow of games, or the Batman Arkham games, very similar combat systems. I enjoy particularly though, the Middle Earth ones have a more ranged component with them than the Batman ones. But I enjoy the different playstyles that you can filter between there and how they're all useful and things like that. So that's some of the stuff that I like in games, and I play them to kind of be able to explore different things. I'm not necessarily like the best top tier gamer, but I think I'm at least somewhat decent. And I like being able to kind of figure out how to do interesting things with what sort of options I have available. And I like to play a lot of different characters in Smash Brothers, for example. I don't really I'll settle on a main for a while, but kind of shift and drift around as I try different things. So that's something that I really like in games, and that's something that I've enjoyed about the Souls games. So I've been playing the Souls series since Dark Souls 1. So I've played Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, and now Elden Ring. I don't play on PlayStation consoles, so I haven't played any of those ones, and I ended up missing Sekiro at the time, and I haven't gone back to that one. So that's a little bit of my background there. I played Elden Ring on PC. I did not play it until I got a computer that could actually run it. Like, I pre-ordered the game, and then my PC wasn't strong enough to run it. But I had to get a new computer at the end of November. So starting in December, I was finally able to play Elden Ring. So I played initially on that, and then for Christmas, before the whole PC thing happened, my family had gotten me a Steam Deck. So I had a Steam Deck that I was able to play on, and I predominantly played on Steam Deck. I have over 300 hours in the game now, and most of those are on Steam Deck at this point. There's some things that I liked about the Steam Deck in particular once I got used to the control scheme, notably the ability to map. There's buttons on the bottom of the controller, and I could map those to various functions like running. So I could run while holding down a button with this finger, this one right here, instead of having to do some sort of weird claw thing. That was really nice, but I was also able to map the buttons on the left hand to D up and D down. So I could do things like swap spells and items without having to stop moving. But I was also able to hold down Y, and I would put torrent on the one, and I ended up putting torrent's healing item on the other. But being able to map things like that was very useful, and I don't want to go back to a controller without those for playing Elden Ring. So I've mostly played on Steam Deck. So I have a bunch of notes that I've written down of different categories of things that I want to talk about, and different things to discuss. This is probably going to be pretty lengthy, because there's a lot that I want to get through. But I want to start with, and there will be a combination of positive things and critiques as well. But I want to start with some technical issues. These are things that I'm not going to dwell on too long, so I just kind of want to get these out of the way, but I do want to note them. So I definitely had some stability issues, some crashes, more on Steam Deck than PC. I'm going to chalk some of that up to just the Steam Deck itself, but From Software as a company, their strengths lie in their design and direction departments. And a game this big, a game this complicated, like there's always going to be a lot of coding challenges. I don't expect these sorts of things to be bug free by any means, but it their programming, their technical side is not where I would consider from strengths to lie. They're mostly competent and they do a decent job with console stability and stuff as far as I understand it. But I've only really played them on PC, and then I played the Dark Souls remastered on Switch. But so I definitely had some crashing. That's frustrating. No particularly big issues. I did have at one point what really precipitated my change from PC to okay, I'm just gonna get used to the Steam Deck controls. Was for some reason the game would like insta crash. Like I had a character that would just insta crash when I tried to load them up. Like it wouldn't even get through the loading screen. Oh, by the way, I should say that there's going to be spoilers. I'm about to say one. So there's going to be spoilers. You probably should have expected that. I don't know, but I just want to state it. I spent, goodness, the game came out in late February, and I wasn't able to play it until December, and I basically managed to avoid spoilers during that entire time. So I was able to do that. And so I just want to make sure that people are aware. I don't know why you'd be looking at a review that's this long and in depth without expecting spoilers, but just to state that up front. Anyway, the game would, for some reason, it wouldn't load my save when I was on the Great Bridge in front of Malekith, and didn't know what was going on. I think I needed to restart my computer. I think that would have fixed it. I don't know how a game gets into a state where it needs that level of restarting in order to be able to like clear stuff out to make it work. It loaded just fine on my Steam Deck though, and so I ended up really transitioning at that point. Another bug that I noticed at one point in time was sometimes objects could just be invisible. Commonly, this would be like a weapon or something like that. So a knight wielding a sword that you can't see, and I haven't noticed that in quite some time, so I don't know if they patched, like if they're able to figure out the cause of that and patch it out. But or if that's just a difference between PC and Steam Deck, which I wouldn't know why that would be the case. But the hardware and underlying software is a little bit different, so who knows? Weird stuff can happen with things as complicated as that. So I haven't noticed that one in quite some time. There's definitely like a few smaller bugs and glitches and weird things at the side. Probably the main other technical thing that I want to mention that I have in my notes is the portal culling can be kind of weird sometimes. And what I mean by that is I'm going to start by explaining what portal culling is for those who don't know. So portal culling is in the general category of culling, which is where you basically choose objects to not draw, because drawing objects takes time, and the fewer things that you can draw, the faster it is to render a frame. So portals, in this case, is referring to things you can see through, like windows or doors, like open doorways, things like that. So portal culling is where you're saying, okay, the player is looking through this portal, this door, this window, whatever. What things can they see through that? Just draw those, or try not to draw too much beyond those. So when I say the portal culling could be kind of weird, what I mean is it would cull more things than it should, and what that would result in is like seeing void beyond. Often, the main place where I really noticed this happening a lot was in the Round Table Hold, I think is what it's called. I don't know, Round Table area, the hub. Particularly running back and forth between the reinforcement wing and the shop wing, the Twin Maiden Husk wing of the area. Going through those doorways, I'd often see into the main area a lot of white through there, which would be them not, like they're calling out too much of the hold area. It's potentially related to loading, but I can't imagine that they couldn't have the whole area loaded in memory. So to me, that seems like culling. And that the main issue that I have with that is that there's a little bit of immersion break that happens with that. But like I understand why some of that stuff can be a little wonky. So Those are the technical things that I wanted to cover. So let's start with category 1, combat. Combat is, of course, at the heart of a lot of these games. So I'm going to be talking more in with the backdrop of having played the Dark Souls trilogy. So it's going to be looking at how have things changed from that, what are the effects of those sorts of changes and things like that. So the first thing that I have on my list is the addition of guard counters. I really like this as an addition that kind of fits in a parry light place. Parrying has typically been what I think of at least a more higher skill, higher tier of technique. It requires you putting yourself at risk. It requires good timing. I'll talk more about parrying in a moment. I don't actually have that in my notes, but I'll talk about that after guard counters. So I think guard counters is a really good thing to have added as something to be between like just blocking and parrying. You still have to be smart about when you do it. It's not just free to guard counter, because of course the enemy can just hit you when you're in the middle of guard countering. The attack has a bit of wind up to it, but it's a really nice option to have, and then it plays into the posture break mechanic that they added, and like that mechanic does a number of good things for them. But this allows you to kind of build towards a critical hit with guard countering, and so I think that's a really good addition. The next thing that I wanted to mention was parrying. I did not parry on my first playthrough. Like my first character, I didn't really do it. There's a number of reasons for this, and it certainly made certain enemies, such as Crucible Knights, a bit more challenging. But the reason is the basic parry skill on a medium shield was just hard to land. Just as a bit of background, I really liked parrying in Dark Souls 1, where it was pretty like the skill floor on that was much lower, and I felt that it was in a good risk reward position in that game in terms of like the ease of doing it and versus how much you're punished, and then the reward that you get for landing a riposte. I in particular in Dark Souls 1 found parrying very useful against Silver Knights. But with Dark Souls 2 and in Dark Souls 3, I generally found parrying pretty hard to land reliably, and a bit beyond where kind of my skill area would be. So I tried some initial parrying with like medium shields in Elden Ring, and I found it doable, but not really worth like the reward for doing it has to be worth the effort of doing it, like the effort of getting good at it, and so it didn't quite feel that way to me. However, on a later playthrough, so actually I should go ahead and state the three sort of builds that I beat the game with. The first one was a strength faith build. I'll get more into some of that later. That experience has a lot of like there's a lot of things from it because of not knowing where things were. But we'll talk about that more with exploration and Buildcraft, which are later sections. Then I played on an Dex Arcane character, and that was a character that I really began exploring builds with. And then I wanted to make sure I had experienced sorceries, so I could talk about sorceries accurately as well as incantations. So I played through an int-focused character that slowly began building up like strength and dex, so I could explore some of the int requiring weapons. So I wanted to, explore a wide variety of things. I also played through a substantial portion of the game with a int faith character using the sort of Night and Fire. I don't remember the exact order of the things, but the special Karian sword, and using some of the Golden Order incantations and various sorceries that require both int and faith. So those are kind of like the main characters that I play through the game on. So it was really with that dex arcane character that I began exploring parrying, using primarily carry and retaliation, which is nice because the parry timing on it is pretty decent. This is when, looking at the wiki and seeing when parry timing and all that sort of stuff is. So that's a spot where, okay, I can now begin to parry these things, and finding particular enemies where it's particularly useful, especially the Crucible Knights. Being able to parry those is a huge, huge benefit, because they are pretty challenging otherwise. So that was a big benefit there. And so this game, I definitely have parried more in Elden Ring than I did in Dark Souls 2 or 3, just because it seems a lot more. Once you realize, some of these parry skills have better parry timings, and these are enemies where, just like Silver Knights in Dark Souls 1, it was especially the spear ones creating openings to actually hit them was easiest with parries, and I feel somewhat similarly about Crucible Knights, especially the sword ones with the Great Shield. So the next thing I have on this is attack chains. So what this is attacks have a certain number of hits before they do like a finisher. And so it's in like Dark Souls 1, for example. You just have you can keep attacking until you run out of stamina. Just spam R1 or whatever until you run out of stamina. But in Elden Ring, you only get so many attacks. Like, there's specific attack chains. A lot of the animations are going to be fairly similar, but there's a final hit. So they do capitalize on this with the I want to say it's the Twin Blade Talisman that improves the power of those hits. But this is something where it means you can't just spam R1 indefinitely. It forces a stop even if you have a lot of stamina. It forces a stop in your attack. And that means like it creates specific openings in the way that you're attacking. So I don't know. This is something as a change that I feel fairly neutral on. I think that there's some benefits that you can get from it, like the ability to have things be specifically stronger on that last hit to reward you for hitting the full chain. And it also means it makes it harder to stun lock stuff, which pros and cons to that as well. But I just want to note that they did that. Jumping, the addition of jumping on combat. So this is like the Dark Souls games, like Dark Souls trilogy, has always had jumping, but it has been we're gonna go with janky and clunky. It's never been great. Like, you've had to be running and time button presses, either pushing the left stick in or releasing and tapping B again, which could also have problems with running away from stuff and then unwinding a dodge roll, resulting in jumping, all sorts of stuff. So they added a proper jump button in Elden Ring, and it adds an interesting dodge option, particularly for ground-hitting attacks, such as some of the shockwave attacks that some of the bosses, particularly I think of Godfrey/Horaloo, having, but the Crucible Knights have them as well. Some of those stomp attacks, being able to jump over them is neat as an additional evasive option. Jump attacks are very strong. They can close distance a bit. They do the biggest thing with them is they do a lot of poise damage, a lot of stagger damage. The risk to reward ratio on them is a bit skewed, and I think they're a bit too powerful. But particularly in relation to some of the other options. The other major way of, so guard counters are a good way of inflicting a lot of poise damage, a lot of stagger damage, posture. I don't know. These systems are all a little bit interwoven and a little bit complicated to kind of like pull apart. But guard counters inflict a lot. Fully charged heavy attacks also inflict a lot. Certain Ashes of War or weapon skills or whatever you want to call them inflict a lot. I think, for example, of Golden Land being able to do a good bit of stagger. Ordovis's spin? I don't know. The one with Ordovis's greatsword where you spin it up and slam it into the ground. Vortex. Ordovis's Vortex. That also deals a ton of staggering poise damage. And then their jump attacks are the other last one. I feel like jump attacks, relative to the other ones, inflict a bit too easily relative to the risk of doing them, but it's fine. I don't know. It's just where you want the game. This is one of those things about game balance that everybody has a slightly different idea of what balance looks like to them. That's going to be based upon like their preferences and their skill level and all these sorts of things. So I think it's nice to have this as a tool for players to be able to use to maybe make some of the challenging things a little bit easier. But again, what balance looks like is going to be different to everyone. And my understanding is that there's some mods that try to recalibrate the game and rebalance things and stuff that have nerfed the power of jumping attacks. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about, I like that. Basically, I like the options that jumping adds to combat. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the removal of the like pushing forward on the stick and then an attack button. So this before would be how you do a jump attack. You do forward plus heavy, and it would also be how you generally do a kick or some sort of guard break maneuver. That's so. Removing these, I think, was a really good idea because they're always a little bit clunky to do, and it was easy to accidentally do them in combat, especially while trying to chase down an enemy. So what I mean by that is if an enemy is running from you or like steps back and you like tap forward to chase them and try to attack, instead you can pull out one of these, or you could accidentally attack when you're trying to do one of these actions. So removing this system that made for easy accidental inputs was overall good, I think. And obviously, kick is now a skill, and jump attack is now jump plus an attack button. So you actually have a couple of options there in terms of which one you do for the full jump attack versus like an air attack, which I think is overall good. Do I have anything else to say about this one? Not really. So yeah, I touched on this earlier with talking about jump attacks, but I think the posture breaking is overall a good addition as well. Just the being able to get a critical when you poise break an enemy is really nice. And I think that's a good addition. That makes it easier to be able to get critical hits and not just backstab fishing or landing parry ripostes. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was changes with the Y button. So in previous games, Y button, the top button, whatever. In previous games, this was used for swapping to two-hand or power stancing, if you could do that in Dark Souls 2. Holding it down would like two-hand your offhand weapon. There's a lot of weird finicky stuff with this. I think just using it for interact is fine, and then giving it additional functionality while you're in combat is overall okay. There is one issue that I found myself having that I'm going to want to touch on in a moment, but some of the things that they did, I like being able to just hold it down and then pick which weapon you're two-handing. It did take me a while to adjust to this, though, whether it's your left or right-hand weapon. I also really like having hold it down to get access to turning the D-pad into using pouch items. I think that's really useful. One of the problems that Souls games have typically had is having to fiddle with your inventory to be able to find the item that you want to use, whether that's a healing item or some sort of offensive item or a curative like moss, or I don't know why moss, but that's what they chose. Um, or like a resin or grease or whatever they've decided to call it this time for weapon buffs, which I underutilize, I think. But uh, so making something that allows you to be able to do that more intentionally, I think is really good. I think I've probably not been using it the best way. I don't know. I usually have been putting Torrent on up, Spirit, my current like Spirit Ash that I'm really using on left, and I could probably change that to be a different spot, because it's just I think I could get better use out of that one. I've been putting Lantern on right, and then down for the raisins, but that could definitely be tweaked. This is an area actually where I was reading some stuff and I think it was really interesting, where somebody is saying that it's interesting to see how Souls veterans versus newcomers handle this sort of differently, where veterans put healing items on the quick bar where they're used to them, but newer players have often been putting them on that, in those pouch pockets, uh, and is a little bit of a difference. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing. I certainly didn't think about putting healing items there, and I've seen that done, and it makes a lot of sense to be able to be like, I want to be able to get to this quickly and reliably, and I don't have to be fiddling with my pouch to get to the healing. One of the things that is helpful to know is holding down the button for cycling, D-pad down, but for cycling through your items will take you like to the first one in your list just right away. So if you have your healing item there, it'll take you to that reliably, which is not new to this game. There is a problem that I did have with Y being both interact and then holding it down to like do two-handing or whatever, which is that sometimes while I was running around trying to block enemies while picking up items, I'd accidentally two-hand my shield. There's sometimes it will just drop input. I don't know why this happens. This is maybe a technical issue that I should have mentioned, but every now and then the game will just drop input, and so if you're like trying to block stuff and mashing Y to pick up items, or triangle, I guess it is on PlayStation. I don't know. I've always used Xbox controller buttons in my brain because I've been using one of those controllers for a long time now. But mashing that while holding down block and then why am I attacking with my shield? Right. So that's definitely something that could be frustrating at times. I feel like it became less of a problem over time, but it definitely was something that I ran into. So I don't know if any of you ran into that problem or not. I don't think that means that the system is bad, by the way. I just think that everything has some trade-offs, and this is just a potential trade-off on this one, right? Is that sometimes you accidentally will two-hand something while trying to pick stuff up if you're trying to block and pick things up at the same time. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about in combat is that player poise feels too weak to me. So this is something that I definitely was feeling. And then I watched Illusory Wall's video going into the poise mechanics, and it explained why. The long story short on that is that most enemy attacks deal the equivalent of 50 poise damage, which means some deal more, like 100. But the lack of diversity here and the fact that it's always such a high amount means that any amount of poise you have, if it's below 51, is basically worthless. I don't know if they've tweaked any of these numbers at all. But I definitely felt like poise wasn't doing very much for me. Except for maybe during certain heavy attacks, you could get some hyper armor. I've never, I tend to prefer to wield heavier weapons over heavier armor, if that makes any sense. So the amount of poise that you need is pretty high in order to make it work effectively. And it definitely feels like it does feel a little bit like there's some complexity going on here or something with like particularly weak attacks and as level differences develop and stuff like that. And I don't know what's going on with that. But I felt I missed Dark Souls 1 poise to an extent where you could just kind of, if you suited up in Havel's armor, you just wouldn't care. And I know that they've been trying to figure out how to do like where a good spot is for player poise for quite a while. What's weird to me is I feel like enemy poise values should probably be a bit more varied than they evidently are. If I were in charge of making the game, which I'm not, but if I were, I would certainly want to do that where um, attacks with big weapons. I mean, basically, I'd want to do what the player has, right? The amount of poise damage that the player deals. So, if you wield a dagger, it's hard to stagger something, and if you're wielding a large club, it's easy. And I feel like that should apply to enemies as well. Like, I don't feel like a dragonfly should be able to interrupt me quite so easily. But I'm not quite sure where this should fit. I also kind of feel like maybe if enemy damage is low, they have a harder time staggering me as well. I don't know. There's something here, and it definitely feels too weak, and I'm not 100% sure where I'd want it to land, but I'd want to experiment with it some. And I think FromSoft has been having a bit of a challenge figuring out where they want it to be too. So I think it's something that they've been experimenting with, and that's going to sort of result in that. The next thing I wanted to talk about was healing miracles. So, like I said, my first character was a strength faith character, and I definitely tried using healing miracles. Now, being a strength faith character, I did use the claw mark seal. It's like I know it's the I wanted to call it the talisman that you get from Gronk, but that's if they're not talismans in this game. This is an aside, but that I have in my notes further down. It took me a really long time to remember that it's seals that cast incantations, and like I would be going around in the world and I'd just pick up a seal and I'm like, what the heck is a seal? And I'm like, I don't know what this is for. And it's like, you've been using a seal this whole time. I don't know why they decided to go away from like talisman or chime to seals, but whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just it took me a while to relearn the terminology, and I definitely remember, particularly in my first playthrough, I distinctly remember picking up the Golden Order seal. That's the int faith scaling one that boosts Golden Order incantations, and being like, what the heck is a seal? Like, I remember picking it up and being so confused about what it was until I remembered. But anyway, I bring that up because my understanding is that for some reason, the healing or the healing incantations specifically scale only with the faith part of seal scaling, regardless of what the seal scales with. That felt like a tongue twister. And so overall, I kind of felt like they felt weak to me in the sense that, and I'm not talking about like protection or condition removal. Those were good. In particular, the condition removal was extremely useful, and being able to use Cure Poison earlier on was really nice. And then later, Flame Cleanse Me is superb. But what I kind of mean is that the relative amount of HP healed to FP used feels like a bad ratio. And I don't know if this would feel better if I was at like 80 faith with the, I don't know, whatever the best faith specifically scaling seal is at that point. Maybe it's the Erdtree seal. I'd have to look that up, but maybe then it feels all right. But a lot of the time it was just very underwhelming to me. Like I would just use a huge chunk of FP and it's like, this is not worth this much FP. In general, we're gonna just hit like a little mini section here. In general, it feels like From Software really doesn't want the player healing much outside of flasks. So it feels like they don't want them not healing outside of the Crimson Flasks. Cerulean Flasks is an entire other issue we'll get to in a moment. I say moment. We'll get to at some point. But it very much so felt to me like this is where I want to go into a history lesson. So in Demon Souls, you have your grasp, but we're not worrying about Demon Souls. We're worrying about the games I played. So in Dark Souls 1, you can get up to 20 Estus flasks, but this is per bonfire, so it's bonfire specific, but you could also heal with humanity. And then Dark Souls 2, made by a slightly different team in terms of like leadership and all that sort of stuff, has a ton of healing items. So your Estus is big time nerfed, although you can now move using it, I think. Or maybe you're rooted with Estus, but you can move with life gems. It's been a while since I played Dark Souls 2 and 3. So they kind of, particularly Dark Souls 2. But you can use Estus to heal, but there's also life gems of several different sizes. You can carry a bunch of those. Divine favors, which have been in the games for quite some time. I mean, they're in Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. And then there's the Rouge Water and Crimson Water that also heal HP and restore spell casting charges. And then there's the medallions that cure poison and heal you. As you're getting the picture, there's a ton of healing items that you can get. And they very much seem to want to back off of that. So this is where, like, Dark Souls 1 didn't have any spellcasting restoration. They introduced that in Dark Souls 2 with herbs, I want to say. Now, I know Demon Souls had whatever, if I don't know if they called it FP, but they had mana in that game, and you could restore it with spice. I know that for spellcasting. But Dark Souls 1 used spell charges. I have more thoughts on that I want to get to in a moment, but then Dark Souls 2 introduced the ability to restore spell charges, and then Dark Souls 3 had the Ashen Flask in his addition to the Estus Flask to restore FP and introduced FP, and then as well as weapon arts and like you know what? I should save that for miscellaneous later. Okay. So with the introduction of that, they introduced an item to restore it, but it's like there's the hidden blessing that could restore your FP, but you can only carry one of those at a time. And then they've done so many little iterations on everything over time. So your main way of restoring those was with the Ashen Flasks. So now you're torn between, do you want to spend your healing items on your mana or on your health? And so that creates a bit of a tension that you're having to deal with. And so they really cut down on outside sources of healing. Like, you could use embers in Dark Souls 3 to heal, but only once. And you had to be unembered to be able to do it, right? So you could only use it to heal to ember up, which also gives you a health buff. We'll talk more about that later, though. And then you could use your Estus flasks, healing miracles, and then but the healing miracles again used a lot of FP, felt kind of weak to me. And then there was a divine blessing that you could carry with you. So your ability to heal outside of the flasks was very limited, and I feel like that. Oh, there's also Sigbrow, but that's very similar to the meat dumpling things, the raw meat dumplings in Elden Ring that you can technically use to heal, but it's kind of a weak heal with. In that one, it's an upside, but in this one, it's a bit of a downside because it poisons you. But my point is, it really feels like From Software doesn't like people healing outside of the flasks. They really want to lock you into the flask system, and so they make healing outside of that weak. I know that there's other uses to the healing incantations, in particular uh, against Royal Revenants that will take a lot of damage, and I know that they can have an AoE effect where they can heal party members, like if you've summoned people in, or your Spirit Ashes, which I really do like the addition of Spirit Ashes, but I should talk about that after a moment, after I get out of this section. So I feel like they wanted to like keep the power level of some of those things lower, and like using healing miracles in combat is difficult. There's urgent heal, but it is so weak. Um, but this goes into other things as well, like the Blessed Dew Talisman. Like that was pretty useful early on, but the fact that it's a set amount, I think it's 2 HP a second. That just doesn't scale to late game. So I found it was not useful late game. I feel like it should be a small percentage, like 1%, 2% of your max HP a second, something like that, where or you could do like 1% plus 1 HP or something like that if you want to have a little bit of a flat component. But something to keep it relevant later on. So that's my mini block about how it feels like From Software is really landing in this place where they don't want you to heal outside of the flasks. I personally like having more healing items like Dark Souls 2 does. I like giving the player, because here's the thing, right? The flasks are a renewable resource. Sacred flasks or Estus flasks, doesn't matter. They're a renewable resource. They're free. But the other ones cost resources to use. In Dark Souls 2, you only get so many of them. Like you can go buy more, but then you're having to spend your currency on buying healing items. I think that's something that people should be able to do, and I feel like it's something that From Software doesn't want. So this is where I would disagree in terms of design. Boy, this is going to be a long video. Just looking down at the timer, we're over 40 minutes in. So yeah, it definitely feels like they kind of want to keep low on that. So mounted combat is okay. So this is something where I liked it a bit more earlier on, where it was new and I hadn't experienced it a bunch. The big thing with it is just kind of tricky to figure out the timing to hit stuff. I do think they did a decent job with figuring out a few different like attack patterns for different types of weapons to have. So like holding the weapon down and being able to hit things along the side with the heavy attacks on a number of weapons versus like holding a lance forward or whatever. So I think they did a decent job with like trying to figure out how different weapons work while mounted. Fighting other mounted foes while mounted is just an exercise in missing a lot. Maybe you can get next to them and land a bunch of hits, but if you're like trying to charge each other, like your traditional lance jousting, that's what it's called. Like your traditional joust, it's just finding the timing to hit things with attacks could be really fiddly. Speaking of fiddliness, something else I found to be fiddly was lock on. And I definitely have experienced a lot of like locking onto the wrong enemy. This is one of those things where there's not really good fix, because what the right enemy is kind of, it's wildly divergent depending upon the situation and the person playing and what they actually want to lock onto. And I'm not quite sure how their algorithm works. I do feel like lock on has been better in previous games than it was in this one. And that I don't know if that's just me remembering things poorly or what. But I really felt it at times in Elden Ring, where in particular what would happen is I would lock on to enemies that were more that way instead of proximate. So I feel like, but then there's times where you want to be able to lock onto the distant enemies and not the closer one. I feel like I'd want it to prioritize locking on to and selecting enemies that are within my field of vision that are closer to me. Because you don't want to just do a ring of like, okay, what enemy is closest to the player? Let's lock onto them, because they could be behind you and suddenly you spin around and all sorts of disorienting stuff. So you're probably looking in the direction of the enemies that you're wanting to prioritize. But do you want it to focus in on the enemy that's most towards the center of the screen? Do you want it to focus in on the enemy that's closest? There's a lot of different ways to try to figure out how to lock onto an enemy, and there's no good solution to this, but I definitely had a lot of instances where I was locked onto the wrong thing, and flicking the stick around was not getting me to the thing I wanted to lock onto. I feel like that was more of an issue earlier on as well, so I don't know if I just got better at using the lock-on system, but it's definitely something that crops up from time to time as just a bit of a challenge. Again, it's super hard to solve that. There's the problem is you want different behaviors at different times, and they can only give you a behavior, right? They can't give you 3 different lock-on algorithms in terms of target prioritization. It's just not reasonable. Remember, stay hydrated. So there's no good solution to it. It's something that came up a bunch, I felt like. The addition of stealth is really neat. And I like the bonus for hitting unaware enemies, where you deal, is it 20%? I think it's 20% more damage against enemies that are unaware of you. I think that's really cool. It does feel... I was reflecting on this a little bit earlier when I was reviewing my notes. It's like, okay, this is a nice system to have, but and like there's various ways of silencing your footsteps in the game. There's the black knife armor that does it. There's cotton that'll temporarily do it. There's at least one incantation. I think there's an Ash of War that might do it as well. And then there's the Crepus's Talisman, if I remember correctly. So, like, the ability to just run up to enemies that aren't facing you and just whack them for additional damage is great with those. It is not as fully baked of a stealth system as something like Middle-earth Shadow of War. And so it does not create, at least for me and how I play the game, it does not create a huge difference in playstyle. But I like that it's there. Like, and this is something I feel a lot with Elden Ring, that there's a lot of, okay, they've added this system. It doesn't do a lot. It definitely feels like they could do more with this system, but it's nice that it's there, right? And it'll be interesting to see if they expand on them later. So something that, as I'm just going through my notes here, there are a lot of really cool offensive incantations, but I found them hard to use given how easy it was for me to be interrupted out of them. And it's possible that enough dexterity would make them feel more viable, but I'd want them to still feel viable on my strength faith build. So this is a note that is in particular written having played through the game on a strength faith character, where I was trying to use things like dragon breaths and a number of the lightning miracles and things like that. I dabbled with most, if not all, of the incantations, trying to enjoy them. I think some of this is I just had a really hard time finding the right spacing for them. And I do feel like a lot of... So I remember talking with a friend about Elden Ring, and his observation was that there's a lot of very flashy, impressive-looking miracles. But the problem is or incantations, rather. But the problem is the wind-up on them is very long. And what that results in is it was very difficult for me to figure out the timing of when to start casting them. I do in general, by the way, because I like to play with magic in these games to some extent. I do like the charge mechanic where you get a stronger effect by charging. And then that adds a when should you charge element to it too, which I think is interesting. Having played with sorceries as well, I especially feel this note. The incantations are cool, and a lot of them can be very strong, but I definitely struggled with spacing, as I feel a lot of them are more medium range. And figuring out when to start casting them to be able to hit an enemy that's coming towards me before the enemy actually hits me, but not starting it so and interrupts me out of it, but not starting it so early that the spell goes off before the enemy gets to me was a real challenge. Sorcery just felt significantly more practical as an offensive option than incantations. Not that you can't use incantations well. Boy, that word's a mouthful. Not that they couldn't be powerful or do great stuff. For example, multi-hit ones like the I forget the name of it, but it's the red lightning AoE that would hit a bunch of pillars around you. Kind of like Firestorm, but the lightning version, and I forget what they called it in this one. But that one was particularly good at hitting large enemies multiple times and dealing just an absolutely absurd amount of damage to them. Things like that were really good. You could get a lot of different conditions, frostbite, rot, out of bleeding out of them. But the thing is, sorceries generally allowed you to be able to move and cast repeatedly. So, I mean, you can just see it with the Sir getting off in your fight when he spams Comet at you, and it's like, okay, this doesn't root you to the spot. You move slowly, like you're walking instead of running, but you can still move while casting this, and you can just keep waving your wand back and forth. And like the first one might take a moment to charge up, but then you can just keep going back and forth and spam Comets or Night Comet. Night Comet was really good, just because enemies don't dodge that one as much. It's less powerful, but it's not as quickly dodged. So that one was really, really good. The spiral, I forget exactly what it's called. Spiral shard, something like that. It's the one that you get from Selen for completing her quest line and helping her. That one was really, really good against large enemies like dragons. That's what I killed the Elden Beast with on that character. Just because it against large enemies, it gets a ton of hits in. The other thing too is incantations generally had good area of effect relative to sorcery. So if you wanted to hit a wide area, you were generally better off using incantations, but the tracking on sorceries was substantially stronger. So it was a lot easier to actually hit things. The cast times were shorter. The range was better. So it's just a lot more practical. It felt like to use sorcery rather than incantations. So that's just my general experience with it. And the other thing too is that incantations are quite diverse in what they do, but it doesn't feel like you tended to get stronger versions outside of predominantly the heal incantations. So like you have a whole line of, oh, this is a more powerful heal. It'll eat up even more of your FP bar. Whereas if you look at sorceries, you have like your basic glintstone pebble, and then that has like 3 or 4 tiers up until Comet. And it's like, okay, Comet is your soul spear of this game. And so it just feels like you get progressively stronger, but still usable and useful with sorceries. Whereas like in previous games, you had Lightning Spear, Great Lightning Spear, Sunlight Spear, right? Where you'd chain up to stronger and stronger versions. And incantations didn't really feel like they did that as much. Like, I know there's 2 tiers of all of the dragon incantations that are stronger, I suppose, with the higher level. But those just eat up all of your FP so quickly. So, I don't know. Like, my general feeling is that faith in this game is stronger on the Ash of War unique weapon front, and sorcery is stronger on the spells front, or like into stronger on the spells front. Was kind of a loose feeling that I had from Elden Ring. So, yeah. We'll talk about. I have a whole section for Buildcraft, so we'll talk about some of that stuff more at that point. And stuff is maybe a little bit arranged, whatever, the way I did it in my notes. So another thing that I noted is that there's a lot of enemies that are good at closing gaps. Pros and cons to this. The pro, of course, is that enemies that are able to easily close gaps, you have a hard time like cheesing by backing away and stuff. The con is it also means you don't have room to breathe. I remember playing Code Vein. One of the critiques I had of that game is it felt like most of the bosses, if not all of the bosses, had like an instant activation charge move where they were suddenly just in your face. This Elden Ring is not as bad in that regard as Code Vein, but it definitely felt like there's a lot of enemies that could close gaps very quickly. Another thing that I want to mention in combat that's related to this is just needing to close gaps as the player could be kind of tricky. There's a number of Ashes of War that are good for this. Impaling Thrust, for example, quickly comes to mind. It would have been nice if the descriptions made it a little bit clearer that they were good for gap closing. That's where you're getting in a melee range of something. But there's a number of very large enemies that tended to be very mobile. Dragons could be a bit frustrating in that regard. The ulcerous tree spirits, the big, I don't know, hideous masses that they are, very large, very fast. Fire Giant was also kind of this way where he could just move distance really far, and so just had to spend a lot of time chasing him down. And then the dragons are also kind of like, okay, I'm spending a lot of time chasing you down. I will probably comment more on actual fights against certain types of enemies when we talk about enemies, rather than combat generally. Something else that I wanted to comment on. Let's see. I just have a few things left in my notes on this section. The removal of durability was a good idea. It had become increasingly irrelevant to the series over time. So yeah, I think it was good that they got rid of it. It was like it did do something in Dark Souls 1. You had to repair your weapons occasionally, and it was used as the cost for certain special effects. Usually on your dragon weapons, you could use them for some flashy effect, big explosions, shockwaves, or whatever, depending upon which one. But for the most part, it was just something that you had to kind of keep up. Dark Souls 2, durability mattered just because of, particularly in the PC version, where it was tied to frame rate, how quickly you'd burn through durability. So on PC, you could use it very quickly. And they did, but it would automatically restore when you set up at a bonfire. And then Dark Souls 3, they kind of fixed some of those issues, so it might as well not have existed in Dark Souls 3 for almost all intents and purposes. And then they removed it for Elden Ring, which I think makes a lot of sense because it had gotten very vestigial by the time we were in Dark Souls 3. So there wasn't much point in it. And then my last note is the flashy cool stuff also tends to be super impractical, which is frustrating and disappointing. Or at least that's certainly how I felt. Like the flashier it is, the less practical it is. Meteorites of Estelle is hard to actually hit specific enemies with, and if they're at all trying to attack you, it's not something. Like, it's good opening salvo, I guess. Like, maybe you can open an attack, like a fight against a dragon with Meteorites of Estelle, but you're pinned to the ground, you're stuck there waiting for the spell to go off, and then while it's going off, it's chewing up all of your FP, and then you're done. Like, you're just better off using something like Comet, or better off using, I don't know, Lightning Spear over some of the other options. And it's just things that go off more quickly. Like, some of the weapon arts are this way as well, where it's like, okay, this is a flashy cool weapon art, but it's actually hard to use. Because the windups and other things are long. So those are my notes on combat, which means it's time for crafting. So overall, I liked the addition of crafting. It was a good way of adding consumables to the game. I will touch more on the impact of this later, because there are consequences to having crafting being a primary way of getting consumables. It does add additional rewards that they can sprinkle around the world, both in the form of containers, cracked pots, ritual jars, and perfumer bottles. It gives you use to wildlife in the form of bones and other semi-related things, meats and things like that. I do feel like I generally underutilized consumables that you could craft outside of like ammo. It's a great way of being able to get ammunition for bows and crossbows and ballista and great bows and stuff. That makes those feel a lot more reasonable to be using. So I really liked that aspect of crafting. I liked it as a way of being able to get healing items, although I think requiring giant dragonfly heads for the poison removal item was maybe not the best. My problem with that is it's just a pain in the butt to get those heads, and then you have a hard time crafting your basic poison cure item because you're locked behind needing to hunt dragonflies that are a pain to deal with and whatnot. There's some larger ones and I have very distinct memories of running into those guys too. In Caelid, near Celia, that are a bit easier to hunt, but I overall found it was a touch frustrating to have to go through those. So I definitely think that there's some balancing and tweaks that could be made to crafting to make some of the things a bit more reliable. To get some of the things that I think should be a little bit easier to craft, like those poison cure items. Although this is the flip side, right? By making the poison cure items a bit challenging to craft because you have to get dragonfly heads, it means that the poison cure incantations gain value because now you don't have to worry about those. So there's pros and cons both ways. But overall, like I said, I like it as an addition. I think it does some interesting stuff. I feel like I'd want more practical things to do with some of the meats and stuff. The spot that I tend to come down in is that things that make it harder to get afflicted by conditions tend to be something I favor less than cures to those conditions. There's a little bit of wiggle room for things like bleed, madness, sleep, like stuff where it quickly procs. But sleep is so rare for enemies to inflict in the game. Something I should have covered in combat is conditions. I think I'll talk about it in enemies, though. Or miscellaneous. We'll get to that later. So, like using the immunizing meats and stuff like that is just something I didn't tend to do a whole lot. So I rarely had need to craft them because I found enough just like lying out in the world. I do feel like the game does a better job of encouraging you to use consumables than some of the previous ones, but I don't know. Holy resisting liver is very good against the final boss. I'll say that much. So yeah, I like that. I like that they let you craft stuff, but like I said, there's a consequence to this that we'll talk about under exploration. So reinforcement system. I do want to talk about this. I have more extensive thoughts. I'll get into some of those later. I've written a bunch of stuff down in Miscellaneous. I did make an entire video on my YouTube channel here talking at length about the reinforcement system and the history of reinforcement system. So I'm going to touch on a few things here. So getting more seeds than required to fully upgrade your flasks is both reasonable in terms of quantity of flasks, is both reasonable and a little bit of a feel bad. I'd like something to do with my extra seeds. In New Game Plus, I'd like something to do with my extra sacred tears. I personally feel like you shouldn't have a cap. Is this quite the right word? I feel like I'd want the cap on sacred tears to be higher than one New Game cycle. This has only been the case in Dark Souls 1, where you could not max out your reinforcement to your Estus flasks in terms of potency in Dark Souls 1 in one New Game cycle. You could get all of the items for it, but getting all of the items to do it would prevent you from being able to get it because you have to use the Firekeeper Soul, and there's only so many of those, and if you get all of them, there's no Firekeepers left to reinforce your flasks. I feel like you should maybe be able to get them to like plus 15 or 16 or something. Just that way they're stronger in New Game Plus when your HP values are higher. But this is very much so a balance thing of how much HP should the player have, because each flask represents additional HP. I think ideally what I'd want is a different system that, and I'm game designing on the fly here, that restores up to a certain amount. Like you have a bank, an Estus bank, and I feel like I would want, in terms of like total HP that your flasks can heal, and taking a drink will consume some from that bank of X. Like it will restore however much you're missing up to a certain amount. So you still will have to double tap heal at greater damage levels. Yeah, so I think the system that I want, would ideally want with something like Estus, is you're reinforcing how much healing total you have in your bank. And then using an Estus will restore up to 50% of your max HP, something like that. So if you take a lot of damage, you have to double tap to get a full heal out of it, which adds additional healing time, additional risk in terms of time spent healing. But it also means you can top off without consuming an entire flask. That, if that makes sense. So I think I'd want something more like that. It's a very different system, though. But yeah, I just would like something more to do with extra seeds in particular. So being able to trade them in for like rune arcs or something like that would be nice. A problem that I've always had is the final upgrade material being limited. I just don't like that. Let me buy infinite ancient smithing stones, somber or regular. Let me buy infinite great gloveworts, grave and ghost. It's fine if that's really late in the game. I'll talk about that more under exploration, though. And it's fine if that's an NG Plus perk. Like being able to get unlimited quantities of those in NG Plus only, not regular New Game, is fine. I did feel that there were too many tiers. I don't... So the reinforcement system is good from a sense of allowing people to get stronger in ways beyond just getting levels. I kind of don't like how it's structured. I don't like how many levels there are to it exactly. So one of the things, and I said this kind of off the top, I like being able to play different playstyles. I like variety. And one of the big ways in which I fight again, like that Souls games hamper that, is through the upgrade system, meaning that you're really, and the reinforcement system, meaning you're really investing in specific things, and it makes it harder to explore new stuff that you get. Again, I'm going to touch on this more in both exploration and miscellaneous because I decided to put it down there. Uh, I I think that there's ways of handling the reinforcement system that I would like better, and I feel like they've been moving away from systems that I like. Um, Again, there's an entire video on this that you can look at. So, and it's like 50 minutes, so I'm not going to get into all of it here. One thing that I do really want to touch on, this is a little bit more of an exploration thing, but there's pros and cons to having um, tiered materials for like somber stones and gloveworts instead of just needing more and more the higher you go. So, in the Dark Souls trilogy, Twinkling Titanite is sort of the closest approximate that's consistent across all three of them. Um, and the way that worked is you would use a greater and greater amount of Twinkling Titanite the higher you got. So weapons would go up to +5, but +10 is just extending that system, right? So you would need like 1 for the first one, and then 1 for +2, but maybe 2 for +3, and then another 2 for +4, and then 4 for +5. That's the quantities you needed for Twinkling Titanite weapons in Dark Souls 1. And so you'd need like 10 total. And you'd slowly get there, and it was pretty rare to get Twinkling Titanite, so you had to pick and choose which weapons you're getting, and I'll touch on more on some of the consequences of that later. So the fact that you have different tiered stones, where it's a Somber 1, Somber 2, Somber 3, or Grave Glovewort 1, Grave Glovewort 2, Grave Glovewort 3, boy, that's a tongue twister, means that you're instead of having to invest all of those into one thing, you're kind of encouraged to try different things around, which has some positives, but we'll get into some of this in a moment for some of the downsides. One of the big downsides that I really ran into in my first playthrough is you can get choked at various tiers. So I distinctly remember having found, because this is very much so an exploration thing, where like what grave catacomb areas have you found that have given you Grave Glovewort? Well, if you found a bunch of ones with Glovewort 2 but not Glovewort 1, like this is an experience that I had a bunch of Grave Glovewort 2, but I had, and like even above that, like I basically just I was not exploring Limgrave thoroughly enough. And because I wasn't exploring Limgrave thoroughly enough, I was really, really choked on Grave Glovewort 1s. I found like 3, maybe. But I had a bunch of 2+, and so I spent, because, the order in which you find spirits, you don't know what you want to save for. So, I'm investing into your noble sorcerer, your wandering nobles, your weak spirits. And so I'm like, oh, I want to be able to level up some of these new spirits I found that seem really cool and new and exciting. I have all of these 2s. I am 2s, 3s, 4s. Excuse me here. Too much talking. It's been, almost an hour and 15 minutes. So I have all of these coming out of my ears, but I have no ones to be able to get going, and I cannot find the bell bearing to upgrade them, to be able to purchase them. So I was just really choked on those ones. This was a really frustrating experience for me, and I eventually, started, like, I got far enough that maybe I felt comfortable watching the Playframe playthrough, and so I was like, oh, he's running into things that I completely missed, and now I'm finding more Glovewort. But when I'm going into it blind, I don't know where anything is. I don't know how to find stuff. I'm going to miss a bunch of things, and that's fine. That's just how it goes. But it does mean that this system really chokes you. Another thing that I found is I found this with Somber as well as I played more, where because hands drop Somber stones, this hand spider enemies, I would get more 2s and 4s in particular, because the ones in the Carrion Manor drop 2 stones, and where's the one that dropped? I forget offhand where the ones that drop 4 stones are. Mount Gelmir. The Mount Gelmir ones drop 4 stones. Because of that, because there's one mountaintops of the giants that drop 7s, but because those enemies drop a bunch of those stones, those are ones where I'm going to have a greater surplus of stones, so I'm going to get bottlenecked at certain stone quantities. And that was something else that I noticed that was kind of frustrating. So, okay, that's too much time on reinforcement systems, but I have a lot of strong feelings there. Not a lot of feelings, just very strong ones. So let's get into Buildcraft, where we're going to touch on a bunch of things, starting with Ashes of War are fantastic. I really like the Ashes of War system. Being able to assign a variety of different skills to your weapons allows you to do the thing that I love. Play around with different playstyles. Try different stuff. It adds diversity. And I think that's really, really neat. Something I personally would consider is getting rid of heavy attacks and just having that be the skill. So you have your attack chain on your bumpers, and then your triggers are just going to be whatever the skill is. That way you can have the skill of your left-hand weapon and your right-hand weapon both available at the same time without having to two-hand. I think that would have been really neat. I don't... Like, they've given a lot of utility to charged attacks specifically by giving them a lot of poise damage for fully charging them, and I think that works well for combat. We discussed that. But something that I would be interested in trying would be getting rid of heavy attacks and just replacing them with Ashes of War, like with your weapon skills. But I really enjoy weapon skills. I think they're a lot of fun. I think that's a really good idea. I like the way that's bundled with infusions as well. I like the new infusion system, how easily it's changed when you get whetstones and stuff. This is something, however, that I ran into some difficulties in my first playthrough. Being a strength faith character, finding the sacred thing all the way locked behind Lendel. But we'll talk about that more with exploration. Something, however, so there's a couple of things that I feel like were notably missing from the Ashes of War / infusion system. One of the big ones is I don't know why there's not Ashes of War that let you cast spells with your weapons. So Dark Souls 2 in particular had this, where there was a mace that could cast miracles. There were a couple of weapons that could cast sorceries, basically act as staves. And I really would have expected there to be an Ash of War that could function this way, where you could use it like an Ash of War to be able to cast incantations with your weapon, or an Ash of War to be able to cast sorceries. And I don't know why that doesn't exist. It's something that I would expect, but here we are. It's not in there. So that's something I feel like was missing. I also think there could have been room for more caster implement Ashes of War. So you can use spinning weapon or no skill on, for some random reason, on staves. But there's not really anything else that you can do with them. And I feel like there's design space for them. In particular, chimes. So in Dark Souls 3, you had 2 miracle casting implements. You had chimes and talismans. Chimes would have a skill that would give you a health regen buff when you used it. So you could just use it for a fairly weak but simple health regen. Talismans would have an alternative way of casting that would cost more FP, but would increase poise. So having increased poise while casting was very useful because it made it much easier to get miracles off. And I feel like having that for incantations would be super, super welcome. It would just make it a lot more reliable to be able to get them off. My understanding is that they do have built-in poise modifiers for some of the incantations, and maybe they've tweaked that some since my initial playthrough, but I played pretty late, starting in December. So I know they did a lot of tweaks before then. But I definitely feel like there was more room for them. Something else is I feel like there's more room for interesting infusions. Like they have a lot of very good basic ones. Your traditional heavy, keen, quality. So your strength, your dex, and your both ones. They did interesting stuff with in terms of like they have your damage type ones. So your lightning damage, your do they call it magic? I think they call it magic in this game. But your magic damage, your fire damage, your holy damage, but they don't have for some random reason they don't have. Oh, and then your like conditioning in one. So your frost build up, your bleed, your poison. Is it just bleed and poison? Yeah, and then the scaling with occult. So I feel like there's room for more of the conditions to kind of come into play. Um, so you can't inflict like there's weapons that have madness built in. There's weapons that have rot built in, but there's no infusion for that. Um, there's no infusion for sleep. I know that Elden Ring Reforged adds a bunch of interesting infusions, and I would like to see more, particularly in some DLC that I know they're working on. I would like to see more interesting infusions. In particular, what feels very weirdly missing to me are Faith Int infusions, like infusions that scale with both Faith and Int. In Dark Souls 2 and 3, they had this with Dark in particular. I think Fire as well scaled with both. But as a little Fire's handled differently across like all of the games, so that one's a bit confusing. Here it makes a lot of sense that Fire is specifically a faith-based thing, but with specifically Faith Int, that like they got rid of Dark, which is fine. They can do whatever damage types they want, but they got rid of Dark and they got rid of because Dark would scale with both Faith and Int, and they have some really good clues for things that could fit in that role. In particular, the Death Flame, like the death oriented sorceries. So like your Rancor, and these are ones I didn't play with as much. But your the ones that benefit from the Death Prince's staff. Those ones are both Int and Faith, like they require both. And Golden Order also requires both. So you have an incantation like Holy Side, and then you have kind of like your Dark Side. So I could see like a Death Flame infusion that deals magic damage with Frost and scales with Int and Faith. And I could see Golden Order infusion that deals holy damage, and maybe has bonuses versus undead. I don't know. Kind of like your Golden Order stuff does. But that could also scale with Int and Faith. So the fact that they are missing those feels really weird to me. And I don't know why they did things that way. Something else, though, that I also noticed is that and we're going to need to get into this more under exploration or something, or no, this is something I have under miscellaneous, but smithing stone distribution really affects how much I use Ashes of War. Because of the way things are distributed in the game, especially on repeat playthroughs, it's just much easier to level up a somber weapon. Just so much easier. And then you can't use the Ash of War system. So you're kind of like cut off from the Ash of War system just because somber weapons you can't Ash of War. And they're just... there might be an exception here or there, but you can't use Ashes of War on them. You can't infuse them. So they're... like they just, because it's so much easier to upgrade them, because it's so much easier to get the somber stones you need, as opposed to the regular smithing stones. I really feel like Ashes of War kind of like their usefulness is really decreased, especially just because leveling up a somber weapon is just so much easier. That it kind of you end up there instead of using regular weapons. So that's something that's kind of a little frustrating to me. Like there's a lot of really cool Ash of War skills on somber weapons, but you're also kind of like not exploring the breadth of the system just because it's like, oh, well, this somber weapon is so much easier to upgrade. So I don't know. Something else in Buildcraft, I like the simplification of spell categories. So this is something that I think is really neat. They have sorceries and incantations, but within those they have a diverse breadth of concepts for them. So like under incantations you have Dragon Breath, and those require Faith and Arcane. Um, you or well, it's just not just Dragon Breath. It's mostly Dragon Breaths, but like you have Claw and other ones. Then you have the like Dragon Cult ones that benefit from Gravelstone, and those are like lightning themed. And I really wish we'd gotten a red lightning spear that wasn't just a weapon skill. But anyway, then you have the Bloodfire ones and the Godskin. What do they call them? I don't know. The black ones, the Black Flame ones, and then you have just the Fire Giant. So like, there's a bunch of different varieties there. A couple odds and ends that like you have what 2 that count as rot or whatever. Maybe 3 poison misfits in there. So you have a few loose ends here and there. And then you have sorceries, a similar sort of thing, where you have the sort of like the Deathrite ones, or whatever you want to call those, that benefit from the Prince of Death's staff. And then you have the various glintstone varieties, and the Histalian. And so there's some interesting ways that they've kind of like subcategorized them, but simplifying things, like, because in Dark Souls 3 they had miracles and hexes and pyromancies and sorceries, and it was just kind of all over the place, and stuff got kind of complicated. So I appreciate that they simplified a lot of this. I am really confused why there's a lack of sort of a joint staff seal, like a caster implement that can cast both sorceries and incantations. That's something that I'd kind of expect to exist, but for some reason there just isn't. So I don't know. That's weird to me. I liked the crossover caster implements in Dark Souls 3, where you had the white-haired talisman that could cast pyromancies and miracles, and you had the bell chime that could cast sorceries and miracles. I think hexes were either sorceries or like they were slotted into the other categories, but I liked having joint things like that, and I would have expected something like that in Elden Ring. I don't know why there wasn't, but anyway. Another thing that I mentioned under Buildcraft for some reason is I'm just really surprised there's so few passive FP regeneration items. Like, there's very limited Starlight Shards, and that's it. The only other way of getting FP back is if you use your Flask of Wondrous Physique on it, or the... I think it's just that and the Cerulean Flask of Tears. This is something that I've been thinking about some lately. I really feel like... Oh, there's also some weapons, and there's a couple of other ways of getting FP back, but there's no like passive regen, right? So there's the blue assassin thing, talisman that restores FP on critical hits. There's a couple of weapons that restore FP, I think mostly on enemy death, and then there's also the talisman that restores FP on enemy death. But they're all pretty weak. It feels like they really don't want to let you get FP back outside of the Cerulean Tears very easily. And I'm not entirely sure why. Something like, I was expecting to find the FP variant of the Crimson Dew. Is it Crimson Dew talisman? I have it written in my notes earlier on here. Yeah, Blessed Dew, the Blessed Dew talisman. I was really expecting to find an FP version of that. I was expecting to find an FP version of of a tier, or is it tiers? Whatever. The Wondrous Physique item. Like there's HP regen, there's stamina regen, but there's no FP regen. I found that really weird too. Like there's just a lot of a lack of FP regen, and I find that very strange. Um, I just would have expected it. It feels like From was really scared of letting you get more FP easily, and I'm not really sure why. Um, Part of why I note that as well is Dark Souls 3 has a simple infusion as well. So then there's no equivalent to that either. Whereas, like, okay, you get lower damage, but also FP regen. Um, there's also the Blessed one in the Blessed infusion in DS3 that gave you HP regen, and there's not an equivalent to that either. So this is actually related to something that I've been feeling in general, which is that I actually kind of prefer, like, as I've been playing with it, I kind of prefer the spell slot method of limiting spell casts that Dark Souls 1 and 2 use over FP based that Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring use. I feel like it leads to differing build decisions. So when all of your miracles or source, when all of your spells, let's just use the catch-all term here, when all of your spells draw from the same resource and you also use that resource for weapon skills, so my brain just hit game designer mode. So when this happens and there's no regen, especially, they're all competing against each other. So what you end up with is a situation where there's no room for like the reason to use weaker stuff is because it costs less FP, so you can kind of get more casts. But like in Dark Souls, if I'm playing a caster, I might want to load up on soul arrows in addition to soul spears because I only get 4 casts of soul spear per equipped one. But the thing is, I can still get like 120 casts of soul arrow because it's like 30 per, and I can slot in 4. So like maybe I have 8 slots, and I spend 3 on soul spear, and crystal soul spear. But then I spend, like 3 on a bunch of soul arrows, and then maybe a few on great soul arrows or something like that, because I'm getting some variety. I'm not just I cannot spend my entire selection of spells on soul spears just because I don't have that many copies of the spell. Or maybe I want something that I can use on regular enemies in between, and I want to save soul spears for something stronger. In DS3 and Elden Ring, because spells are tied to FP, I don't like. I'm going to basically spend all of my FP bar on the strongest spells because it's a waste of FP to use it on the cheaper ones just because their damage is so much lower, right? So I actually kind of like the incentives and the way that builds work out when it's not reliant on FP. Additionally, like I'd probably, because I think there's other ways of getting the costs of weapon skills as well. So one potential method is hits. Just hitting enemies restores FP, and then you can expend that FP on weapon arts. Another option is hitting enemies, building up a meter that then you expend, like Guild Wars 1 Adrenaline, for those who are familiar with that game, where hitting enemies will build up a resource that you can then spend on weapon arts or weapon skills or whatever you're calling them in this particular game. Names are super flexible in this sort of thing. I just feel like there's other methods that you can use for charging those up or making them available. I don't know. Everything just drawing from the FP bar is a little bit of a frustrating bottleneck, especially with sort of the limited availability of it. So I feel like that there are different ways that some of these things could be handled. that I'd be interested in exploring. Is really what it kind of comes down to. I think that you can bottleneck everything on FP, but doing so, I would want to give the player more ways of getting it back. Something else that I might as well just mention now because I don't have it in my notes is I feel like having to spec into things like Vigor and Mind to be able to use your stuff is uninteresting, and I'd kind of want to tie HP to other stats, if that makes sense. I don't know the best because it's good to have sort of limits. And like one of the nice things about having Vigor or Mind as extra stats that you have to invest in is if you're investing in other stats, then you're obviously not investing into those. Something I've always had is you know what? No, that thought belongs under like a miscellaneous or final thoughts section. So I'm going to table that one for the moment. But yeah, it's just one of those things where as I've been thinking about, like, leveling up Vigor is not the interesting part of the stat system. It's not the interesting part of leveling up in any of these games, whether or not they call it Vigor or Vitality or whatever they're naming it. And it would be kind of nice to be able to focus on the interesting parts, which is like, okay, what weapons, what abilities am I getting access to thanks to this system? Let's move on to talismans. I kind of like, so this is the next note thing. I kind of like slowly gaining ring slots with the talisman system where you have to get pouches over time. I know. I kind of like this. I think it adds an interesting dynamic to the game, to exploration, to stages of development. It means that you're not sitting there with a bunch of empty slots when you first start the game with like no talismans as well. And something else, just as a huge point of praise for the game, as I do feel like the talismans are a lot better and more interestingly balanced than Dark Souls rings were, especially Dark Souls 3. I feel like they just tended to get very uninteresting in those. And this one, I feel that they're in a better spot where I have reasons. Like, a lot of the time, I'm going to default to the Erdtree's favor and additional things. But like Erdtree's favor is one that is hidden / you get kind of late depending upon a variety of circumstances. So if you don't know where it is, like it took me a long time to find those in my first playthrough. I think it wasn't until I had gotten far enough that I was looking stuff up that I found the very first level of Erdtree's favor, actually, because that one is in an obscure location. And it's not just a default that I'm going to want the stamina regen talisman. It's not just a default that I'm going to want this one or that one. I don't know. I feel like they're in a much better spot because one of the big criticisms that I had of Dark Souls 3 is they gave me a lot of rings, but the good ones are just so obviously good, like obviously the best. That's very, very rare that I'm going to want a different ring. And if I do, it would have been for like, okay, this is buffing your spellcasting. And I just feel like they're in better spots in this one for making me want to use different loadouts of talismans. So I feel like they've gotten better at that, which I'm happy about. The next thing that I want to talk about is the Flask of Wondrous Physique, however you want to pronounce this. I think it's a really cool addition. I like the ability to kind of mix different effects together. I definitely had ones that I favored, but I think there's a lot of utility to this that is like I could explore it more in terms of some of the utility. I think it's really cool, and I like the versatility that it adds. I'm kind of a little bummed out that you can only get one charge. That, like, the fact that you can't get more in New Game Plus even is a little meh. So it would be cool if DLC, for example, would give us additional flasks of Wondrous Physics so we could, get a few more charges of the thing. But the big thing is that there's nothing in the world that can recharge it. Like only resting at a great site of grace can refill the flask of wondrous physic. Um, and so like sacred flasks can get refilled by various mob triggers or by the respective scarabs. And so like that's a way that you can kind of extend how much time you're spending out away from a grace. But the flask of wondrous physic doesn't do that. So it's like, okay, I want to save using this for very specific difficult encounters, bosses usually, and not just like random exploration. And it would have been nice to have ways of this getting of the flask of wondrous physic getting recharged out in the world in the same sort of manner. Like even if it didn't get a scarab, if it just had it would get recharged too on clearing camps, just like the sacred flasks would. Where it's like, okay, you defeated this enemy or this group of enemies, and it recharges your flasks. If it would recharge the flask too, that would be nice. But overall, I like the flask of wondrous physic. I think is a really cool addition, and I'm glad that they did it. So that brings us to great runes. So I like the idea of great runes. I think it's a really cool idea. It's in particular, it could really serve to vary up what you're doing with your build. Okay, so here's the thing. It feels like great runes were designed in the process of them looking at the Ember system from Dark Souls 3 and saying, what can we do with this? And great runes tie into, like, it feels like an evolution from the Ember system. So this is a system that is kind of trying to address this thing that they've been doing in all of the like Souls games, all the way back to Demon Souls, where you have like your I don't even know what to call this because it's been different each time a little bit. So Dark Souls 1, you're hollowed. Demon Souls, your spirit form has big downsides for being spirit form. But so Dark Souls 1, you go hollow, you look terrible, and then you can restore your humanity, and that lets you interact with multiplayer. So you can summon, do PvP, get invaded, all that good stuff. You can also kindle bonfires, which increases the amount of essence you get back. But you don't really need to be in it. Like there's mechanical benefits in terms of things you can do. But there's not any other things attached to it. In Dark Souls 2, they're really exploring the idea of the curse of hollowing. So each time you died, you lost a little bit of max HP to a certain cap that could vary depending upon other factors in the game. Half was kind of the standard level, so you could lose up to half of your max HP, and it decreases slightly each time you died. Also, the first time you died, you became very green and ugly, in my opinion. Ugliness is a subjective measure. And then you could use an item to reverse that. It wouldn't heal you, but it'd restore your maximum HP. This is obviously very punishing, though. So Dark Souls 3 comes along. They introduce Embers. They get away. Hollowing is still in the game, but in a very different way. So if you die, you go to your base state, which is unembered. So you ember up and you get bonus maximum HP, which is the same thing as losing maximum HP when you're unembered, but a different sort of direction. And whenever you would defeat a boss, you'd get embered, which is relevant because we'll discuss that in a moment. So great runes and their effect feels like it is an evolution of that system, of that ember system, where when you're in this runed up state, embered up state equivalent, you have additional benefits. So they decided to try a variety of things and not just more HP. But most of them are just more HP. Godric's definitely feels like the general best, with an asterisk of it stops being the best the more you're hitting soft caps on stats. But below that point, it definitely feels like getting +5 to all stats is really strong. There's some that are doing interesting bonus effects. Rickards doing the Taker's effect to heal you. Millennia making your flasks be weaker, but you can sort of get the Bloodborne heal on hit effect is interesting. The core idea is cool, but I find the execution extremely underwhelming because they don't have any effect when you're not runed up. When you're not runed up, they do nothing. So their overall impact feels very limited on the way that I play the game. I would have liked to have seen a greater range of effects on these. So you have, I don't know what Mogs does. I didn't really use that one. But Morgoth's is more HP. Radahn's is more of HP, stamina, and FP, so it's more of all of your stats, presumably not as much as Morgoth. Godric's is +5 to all stats, which is super strong. And then Millennia's is this weird alternate heal thing. Records is an alternate heal thing. Mogs is some friggin' buff thing with, I don't entirely know because I didn't really mess with it. It sounded really weird and hard to use. And then there's the Rune of the Unseen, which you can't actually slot in because it's the lore explanation for why you can rebirth and not get screwed up. It's the Rune of Perfect Birth, not Unseen. I don't know why I said Unseen. But I feel like there's room for more interesting effects on those. But I'd like some sort of effect, even minor effect when you're not under the influence of a rune arc. I'm not sure what that should look like, but I would like some sort of effect when you're not rune arced. A big problem here is that rune arcs feel like a very rare item, and I don't want to use them willy-nilly. And unlike Embering, you don't automatically get a rune arc from beating, like, the rune arced up state after beating a boss. Even not even a shard bearer. Like there's no time in which you get runed up. So after beating a boss in Dark Souls 3, you'd get embered up. You'd often get humanity drops from enemies in Dark Souls 1, which is kind of a somewhat similar concept to a rune arc. Using a rune arc does heal you. No, it heals you and restores FP, but not fully. I'm not entirely sure the mechanics on that. If it's just however much it gives you, it restores to you, or not. But the other thing too is you lose the rune arc effect if you go to the Grace and switch your Great Rune. So like if you're on Godric's and you want to switch to Morgoth's, if you're runed up, you're going to lose your runed up state. So you have to use another rune arc. I just feel like as an extension of the Ember system, it's a cool way to extend it, but taken on its own, it feels underwhelming. It feels kind of weak. It feels like it has a lot of potential for doing stuff that's underexplored. So I think it's a cool idea, and it's something where if they make an Elden Ring 2, I'd like them to explore it from the position of the mechanic itself, like what it itself could be as a mechanic, and not just from the position of this is an evolution of Embering. I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but something like the fortune system from Elden Ring Reforged could be an interesting direction to kind of take the idea, if that makes sense. For those who are familiar with that, where it has a wider variety of changes that even apply passively somehow, and then runed up doing something additional. The thing is, I don't feel like they need the sort of runed up system anyway. Like it's a staple of the Dark Souls trilogy and Demon Souls before it, but this is Elden Ring. It can be its own thing, and it doesn't have to follow that same formula. Let's just put it this way. I didn't understand that rune arcs were necessary to activate the effect of the Great Rune for a very long time, because they felt too rare and precious to use. And then I slotted in Godric's rune, and it said it increases your stats, but it didn't say you had to be under the effects of a rune arc to increase your stats. And so I slotted it in, and nothing happened. So I was very confused. So I feel like this is an area where they could make this a really interesting and compelling part of Buildcraft. They just need to iterate on what they've got. And linking it specifically to being runed up is like exclusively to that, something that kind of feels a bit wonky to me, and I don't entirely like. Okay. So this brings me to enemy distribution. Uh, so I made an entire video about this one as well. It's not nearly as long as the other one, uh, but I bring this up specifically because I very much so felt like Elden Ring like lacked enemy diversity. And it's not that it lacks enemy diversity; it actually has pretty good enemy diversity. But there's a couple of things hampering the perception of it. And one of them is the enemy distribution disguises this. So just kind of briefly recap, you can watch the video if you want me to go more in depth. The issue is that the large areas of enemies. Let me rephrase this. So legacy dungeons, so things like Raya Lucaria, the Volcano Manor, Stormvale Castle. These areas generally do a pretty good job of having diversity of enemies. But the overworld really lacks diversity of enemies. So areas like Limgrave at large, Raya Lucaria at large, the Altus Plateau at large. It's mostly military units that are pretty similar. Demi-humans, which, yes, you do get additional variety of demi-humans within that as you go. And like some pockets of like Misbegotten, bats are everywhere. So there's some very specific marionettes as well. There's some very specific like categories of enemies that just show up in a lot of different places. So while you have diversity, like Volcano Manor has the specific man or the man serpents or whatever they're calling them these days. I think man serpents. It has the pot throwing dudes. It has the like Albinorex that scream at you and bite your face off that I hate. So it has a decent variety of enemies in that regard. That's a different set of enemies, right? You don't really encounter, especially the man serpents outside of that area. You have Raya Lucaria and Celia have sorcerers, and there's like a few other places where you're going to run into them, but it's mostly in those areas that really gives identity to those areas and how they feel. Mohg's area has the very distinct blood Albinorex and blood crows and such. But like you go into Caelid and there's a bunch of soldiers. But Caelid is a good example because it has monstrous dogs and it has the monstrous crows that are distinct enemies, right? So, but then there's the aristocrats. So it's like, but the thing is, a lot of the overworld has very similar compositions of enemies, and so it doesn't create mechanical distinction of experience. And so that's kind of the big thing is you need that mechanical distinction of experience to really make areas feel like they're different. And there's just the way enemies are distributed doesn't create the mechanical diversity of experience in these overworld areas that I would like to have for feeling like there's distinct character to them. Even though the military units have some slight differences between them in terms of like weapon arts that they use and consumables that they use, I still would like it if, you know, there's like 5 different armies in the game. There's Knights of the Cuckoo in Raya Lucaria. There's Godric's soldiers. There's the Redmane soldiers. There's the Lendel soldiers. There's the Haligtree soldiers. So, and then the other thing is that there's just a lot of enemy types that I actively don't want to fight. It's helpful if you know, for example, that the Iron Virgins are super vulnerable to lightning. So get yourself some lightning claws or a lightning dagger if you really want to wreck one of those things, because they stagger very quickly to lightning damage. But this is something that I had to learn from watching videos later. But like, I don't want to fight rune bears. I don't want to fight royal revenants. I don't want to fight monstrous dogs. I especially don't want to fight monstrous crows, especially if they're the blood version. So like, there's a bunch of these enemies that I actively don't want to fight. And so that also kind of makes it feel like there's fewer enemies, just because I'm like, I don't want to deal with these guys. Um, Wraith Caller is also something that I tend to like just want to run past. So I don't know. It's just one. Oh yeah, the putrid enemies too. So it's like there's a decent amount of variety of enemies, but because they're all over the place, uh, areas tend to feel like they lack in mechanical distinction and enemy distinction. And that's something that I kind of wish was a bit different. I'm not quite sure what that would look like. Uh, but that's not my job. It's just something that I've definitely felt. There's something I was talking about wanting to do with enemies, but I didn't write it down, so here we are. There's just so many enemies in this game that just suck to fight, and I just don't want to deal with them. Especially rune bears, royal revenants, and monstrous crows. Those are the worst. Dragonflies are also weirdly bad. Once I figured out how vulnerable the giant octopi were to attacks on their beak, though, they became a lot less bad. So yeah, the enemy distribution hides the diversity for me. Bosses. So this is something that it's really important to know about me is I don't play these games for boss fights. I play them for Buildcraft and like encounters and world exploration and stuff. So I don't play them for bosses. I like the boss fights to be interesting, and somewhat challenging, but I don't like them to be super challenging. So I don't really have a whole lot that I want to say on bosses. I like I don't know. I like some of the stuff that they did in terms of having more like boss weapon rewards built into bosses and stuff. I don't know. There's other systems that connect into bosses that I'll talk about later. Is really what it kind of comes down to. I don't mind how many things are bosses that are also not bosses elsewhere or like boss reuse that much, but I have a whole section on asset reuse immediately after this one in my notes. So I don't know. I don't have a whole lot that I feel like saying about bosses just because I'm like, okay, they're mostly fine. Millennia is really rough with the heal. I guess that can be her gimmick. I beat her on my own if you count summoning Oga to help once. That was enough for me, and I've summoned other players to help. The best way to beat her is to summon in players who can sunlock her and dumpster her. I know that there's various builds that can help. I appreciate that she's like weak to bleed and frost. That's what I want to talk about under enemies. Conditions. I'll just add a note under miscellaneous. Talk about conditions. Note added. I don't know. I don't have. Again, I don't play these games for bosses. I will say that the fact that the games are kind of built around leading you up to bosses is something that I dislike. But I'll talk about that more under exploration, which is in a couple of sections. So asset reuse. Remember to hydrate, folks. I'm fine with asset reuse. I know some people have kind of felt like some areas, especially like catacombs, tunnels, are too repetitive. I myself have definitely been like, yep, this is the same ruin asset over and over and over again for various ruins. So I would prefer less repetition, but it also adds some value. So asset reuse does things like it makes the file size smaller. Elden Ring is like about 50 gigs, whereas, for example, Middle-earth Shadow of War is like over 100. Like, asset reuse decreases how large the files are. That's not nothing. More importantly, it helps speed up development and it makes it cheaper to make stuff so they can make more game for us when they reuse assets. And I feel like they generally did a pretty good job of trying to make each area distinct in some way. Even when they were reusing assets, they kind of leaned into that with a couple of the mini dungeons that played with some of that asset reuse of like, okay, you've seen this room again. Have you? Have you actually? So in particular, I think of the teleporter maze one that played with that, and then there was another one that involved drop downs, um, as well as the Lendel catacombs. So there's like a good 2 to 4, something like that, that really play with that, and I thought that was really cool. More so the first time than repeat visits, because like when you know what's going on, it's like, okay, I just want to loot this place thoroughly, and it's keeping track of where you are and everything. It's just a lot of running around, so they're kind of especially long because of some of what they're doing. But especially that first time of like figuring out what was happening was really cool, and I really enjoyed that. Um, I thought that was, as a first time experience, was really solid. So I don't know. I don't like when they reuse bosses. When they reuse, and they've reused bosses plenty of times. Like Dark Souls 1 has 3 stray demons, and Tauros demon is, you fight that early on as a boss, and there's a bunch of the demon ruins, and they're slapped all over the place. In that one initial area, and then there's a couple later on, and Capra demons also like re-show up. That's the boss early, and then re-shows up as a regular enemy later. So yeah, like I don't mind that they necessarily reused bosses, like Deathrite birds and death birds showing up in multiple different places. Definitely took me by surprise. I think having multiple knights cavalries is fine. I mean, they had multiple black knights and stuff like that too in Dark Souls 1, and I keep going back to Dark Souls 1 just because that one is a good example of some of that. So it's not like that sort of thing is common, and it the fewer things that they have to make more of, the more other things that they can make reusing the same thing. So I don't necessarily mind some of that. And they try to change up some of the encounters some and whatnot. I do feel like sometimes stuff just kind of feels like it's plopped in random places, and I'm not really sure why. Black Knife Assassins in particular is kind of wonky in that regard. Why is this Black Knife Assassin randomly guarding this spot or whatever? But overall, like especially as somebody who's an indie game developer, I completely understand asset reuse, and like yeah, it would be kind of nice if they made more distinct assets for things. If there were a few more shacks, for example, but I don't know. I understand. I think it's reasonable. I don't know. I don't have an issue with this. Exploration. Okay, so there's a number of different things that I have that I want to talk about here, but there's a big thing that I'm going to want to address later. I want to be very clear that I thought the exploration of this game was fantastic on my first playthrough. There's a lot of where is things, just exploring around, coming across vistas. The game has a lot of very beautiful views. It's clear that From Software put a lot of effort into making the game world very interesting to look at, and it is overall relatively dense. There's a lot of things to find and a lot of things to pick up, whether that's crafting materials or upgrade materials, or just new random weapons, random boss encounters in spots you don't kind of expect them, things like that. That first playthrough experience in particular was very strong, exploration wise, and left a very good positive first impression. The first experience getting to the Altus Plateau after beating Mekar was phenomenal. That first experience walking into Lendel was amazing. Looking over the cliffs down at the Rhea Lucaria, they did a really good job with a lot of it. That, even getting warped into the Celia Crystal Cave from that trap and then finding my way out and like, where am I? What's going on? A very interesting, disorienting experience that I enjoyed. And in its own way, once I figured out how to get out of there, boy, that trap was a pain. So there's a lot of, like, I think the exploration was very strong on that initial playthrough, and just sort of the visuals and everything about with it. Going down to Shifra, or Einsel as well, with those long elevators, was really neat. But I have a bunch of notes. So that's kind of the first note. I think very good initial impressions, but I have some criticisms as well. But we'll get to those later. Okay, horse parkour is a thing that they put in my vocabulary, so that's interesting. So let's just spend a little bit of time talking about Torrent. In general, I'm not the biggest fan of mounts. I think that what Elden Ring does with mounts works really well in terms of addressing a lot of my problems with mounts. Going all the way back to Ocarina of Time. Okay, you have to summon your mount and then wait for your mount to arrive. If you can summon your mounts, my goodness. Breath of the Wild was really bad in that regard at first, until they added the DLC that gave you teleporting horse armor. And then that addressed some of the problems with mounts in that game. Let's just say when you have a game where you can climb and then you climb to the top of a thing, you don't want to have to go back to retrieve your horse. We'll probably touch on Breath of the Wild a little bit more later. So Torrent immediately addresses that. The other thing is Torrent introduces some really interesting... he's faster than you. If Torrent's a he, I think so. Torrent's faster than you, but less, and has better jumps and the ability of double jumping and things. But Torrent is less agile, cannot turn nearly as quickly, and your attack moveset is limited. So it creates a very interesting diversity of options in that regard. Having mounts, in some regards, is a concession that your game world is too big if you don't have mounts. So this is something I definitely have felt with Elden Ring the more that I've played it. That the world is dense, but also very spread out. And there's a lot of distance that you need to cover. And so mounts shrink the game world because you cover it more quickly. So game world size is always in relation to player movement speed. This is something that they have encountered with the Sonic the Hedgehog games as well. When Sonic made the shift to 3D, especially post the adventure games, Sonic in 2D was always more about the exploration of the platforming than it was the speed. The speed was sort of the veneer, the special sauce that went into it. So you had specific speed sections. But when Sonic made the switch to 3D, the adventure games kind of captured that initially, but they transitioned to, Sonic goes fast, right? And the platforming and the goes fast are inherently in conflict with each other because the goes fast makes it hard to react to the platforming. So you run into this reaction challenge. There are different ways that you could address that. You could have slowdown where you're presenting the illusion of speed, but you're actually going fast. But one thing that they ran into, and this was a big deal in Sonic Unleashed, was that it just takes a lot of time to make level that you move through very quickly, because Sonic was about goes fast. And mounts do the same sort of thing, where they require a lot of world, and you move across that world very quickly because the mount's movement speed is faster than your basic movement speed. And so I tend to favor a world built around the player's movement speed, not around the mount's movement speed, just because I think that it creates a world that's more interesting to explore a lot of the time. But as far as mounts go, I think Torrent is a very good execution on mount. And I as far as mounts go, I like how they handle stuff with Torrent pretty well. But we'll talk about the game world more later. The next thing on my list is fall damage. It's very non-intuitive and poorly informative. So fall damage in this game, I learned a lot watching probably illusionary wall videos again on fall damage. So the way that it works, just as a quick recap, is you don't take any fall damage for the first 16 Is it feet or meters? It's got to be feet. Right? Maybe it's meters. I don't know. The first 16 unit that you fall, there's no fall damage. And then there's death after at 20 and beyond. What that means is that there's a very small window where you actually take fall damage, which means it very poorly communicates how dangerous a drop was. If you took damage from a drop, that means it was a dangerous drop. Any amount of damage. It also means that things like soft cotton that decrease fall damage don't really do much. Fall damage itself also caps out at like 30% of your HP or something. So you don't get the sense that it was dangerous, even though it actually was. Like by the time you're taking any fall damage, it's a dangerous drop, right? It's a fairly high drop. You were getting close to dying. And if you're taking like 30 or 40% of your maximum HP in fall damage, you almost died from that drop. And that makes it very non-intuitive for how damaging it was, or like for how dangerous of a drop it was. In general, I would prefer drops to be able to kind of extend how far they can go based upon various criteria. So I would prefer, like if you have soft cotton on, I'd prefer the drop to be able to drop further before it's lethal. Like I would want that distance to be able to extend. But they can set that up how they want. The main thing is that the feedback on the dangerousness of drops, I think, is very poorly communicated because they're extremely generous with how little damage you take from it. But because of that, it poorly communicates the danger of drops with fall damage. So I kind of feel like the system is going to be done a bit differently. That said, I really like the Spirit Springs, and I think that was a great way to be able to address some stuff related to that to improve navigation around cliffs. They did a nice job of adding a lot of spots where you could drop down once you realize that you can kind of do that. I will say that that's something that didn't dawn on me as early as it could have, and so it made it take longer for me to figure out how you can kind of navigate around a little bit using drop off spots with the tombs sticking outside of the out of cliffs. But once you kind of realize that that's what they're there for, it does improve your downwards explorative capabilities. But yeah, fall damage is something that I think that they should have handled that a little bit differently, just so that way the player has feedback on what a safe drop even is. It is just such a narrow range that you start taking damage that's hard to build up some sort of sense for it. Navigational aids. So these are things like beacons, marks, and those weird light things that spawn ghosts to guide you. I think that they did a decent job with exploring different options here. The map markers that you can add are kind of a weird assortment to me. I feel like I would want... If I were designing the icons for the markers that you can put on maps, I would have a slightly different selection to indicate things like wandering mausoleums more clearly, and stuff like that. But it works okay. It's good to have them. Beacons are also nice. Weird that's limited to like 4 or 5 without more obviously informing you of that, because it's easy to accidentally delete an old one if you don't realize that it's limited the way that is. Like Breath of the Wild does a limited set of color beacons, which very clearly communicates how many you have. And this one is just like, oh, you place one, and once you get beyond a certain amount, it just recycles them, and that can, if you don't know that that's going to happen, that can throw off your markers. But they work just fine. Those weird light things that spawn ghosts to guide you to hidden stuff is an interesting idea. They didn't really do it a whole lot, but that's fine. It was kind of fun to be able to explore them. Theoretically, you want those to lead you to important things, but I don't know. It could have. It worked fine. It's an interesting way of adding a navigational aid of a follow this. Getting map pieces. I appreciated that they had a fog of war and that there was little obelisks, the stela, on those that would indicate where you could go to find a map. So that was nice. And then there's toggling between above ground and underground maps that I did not realize you could do at first because I didn't thoroughly read the UI. That's on me. for not reading the UI, I guess, but it also would have been nice if it called it out a bit more. I thought you had to use the elevator to get between the two. In the first while, that's how I did it until I was watching the Let's Play and discovered that no, in fact, you could push the right stick in order to be able to toggle between them. Another thing that the game doesn't communicate very well is the ability to set favored graces of sites of grace. If you hit Y, you'll bring up the grace list, which I didn't know at first. If you hit X from that menu, it will just straight take you to the round table hold, which I didn't know until I was watching the Let's Play. And if you push right stick in that menu, the grace list, you can favor a grace. So that way, when you hit Y twice from this standard map screen, it will take you to your list of favorited graces, so you can more quickly get to specific ones. Which is very useful had I known about it, but I did not. So they have a lot of stuff for navigating around the map more easily that I just didn't realize. It is nice having a map and map-based fast travel. And I think they did a good job of like finding some way of limiting that. I do think they needed to better communicate how teleporter traps dispelled their locking effect by resting a side of grace. That was not clear. There is something that will tell you, but it's not. You learn that you can't use sites of grace when you have the little marker over them, and from then on, like, why are you looking for a different mechanic here? So that could have been a bit better cleared, or a bit better explained. Something else that I ran into as a problem with the map is I would hit the button to open the map to close the map, but that just brings up the help menu for the map. And I understand this is a UI thing, but it would have been nice if they'd made an exception there to kind of make things work differently, but I don't know where they would have mapped help then. And I don't know, it's just a little bit of a... my habit is the button that opens the map closes the map, and that's not the case in Elden Ring. And that confused me a lot. So something that I liked about repeat playthroughs is once you learn where things are. So I think the first playthrough has really good exploration, and the second playthrough has really good, oh, I know where things are now, so I can find stuff. And this is like such a... It's great when a game is replayable like Elden Ring. Third playthrough is where I really start running into the, wait, I know where everything is, so then I'm starting to see some issues. Which is like, in the grand scheme of things, that's a really good problem to have in the terms that like that first and second playthrough, like that first playthrough of I'm learning where everything is, exploration is really cool, and then that second playthrough of I know where everything is, so I know how to beeline towards the stuff that I want. Those both having really cool experiences is actually a really good spot to be in. So that's a positive, but I want to get into some more niche stuff later in this that's more complicated. Something I did feel exploration wise in my very first playthrough is I did feel like new gear and equipment was kind of rare at the start. This is just a matter of they have only so much they can reward you with, and they have to distribute it across the entire map. So as a result, it runs into this problem, I guess you could say, of the earlier areas might seem a little sparse, especially as you're trying to get your legs under you for how to explore. So it definitely took a while to kind of find stuff. It was really nice to not have stamina getting consumed unless you're like aggroed with enemies. That made it a lot easier to get around and run and things like that. However, a big problem with the exploration that I ran into on my first playthrough is I had an idea of a build I wanted to make, but finding stuff for that build was hard. Like I said, I wanted to do Strength Faith, and what's an early Ash of War that benefits Faith? Because I favored Faith over Strength, because I really liked casting miracles. Well, the Sacred Blade, Ash of War, that I did not find for a very long time. So I had Sacred Rings of Light, the spear one, and thankfully I was using a short spear, so I could use that, but that was basically the only sacred ash of war that I could find for a very long time. Now, I felt like Faith really was rewarded once I got it up to Altus Plateau, but do you know how long it took me on my first playthrough to get to Altus Plateau? To get to Lendel, where I could find the whetstone blade to let me make regular Ashes of War use sacred? It took a long time to get up there in that first playthrough. I didn't know how to do anything in Fort Faron, whatever, the one next to Grail, where you can find the other half of the Dectus medallion. It was a long time for me before I got up to Altus, and it was a further long time before I got into Lendel. So it felt like it took forever for Faith to really pay off. So just like exploration, you're gonna miss stuff. And so I missed stuff that would have made my build work better. And that's just unfortunate. That's just how it goes. But that's just kind of a downside with how some of the stuff is set up with exploration, all these sorts of things. So the next thing in my list is false affordances. So this is talking about doors that don't open. I first heard the phrase in an Alpha Protocol Let's Play of all things. But this is just referring to they've inserted a door that is a decorative element. In general, Souls games have not had a whole lot of these. Like, there's always been some. Dark Souls 1 has had doors that didn't open, but they're usually barred in some way, or otherwise sort of inaccessible. Elden Ring has a whole lot of doors that don't open, and it could be kind of confusing. Like, oh, here's a door here. Which ones open, which ones don't? And this is something that is kind of frustrating. They at least explain it in Lendel by having them like sealed up. But there's a lot of times where it's like, oh, here's a shack with a door that doesn't open. So this is something that I really felt a lot in the game, is the world maps. Let's discuss Legacy Dungeons and the Overworld separately in this. The Overworld maps, and I'm including Lendel in this, have a lot more appearance of complexity than they actually have, because there's a lot of structures in the world. There's a lot of doors that don't open. They're just the same thing as a large rock formation functionally. And this is something that I've generally felt about the Elden Ring world, is that on the surface, at first impression, it looks complex, but as you dig into it, it's not. It's not actually as deep as it looks like it is. The world is smaller than it feels like it is. It's a grand vista. It's very visually impressive, but when you go to like explore it, like, it doesn't have that much depth. It's not that there's not stuff there. There's plenty of stuff there, but it's just spread out a little bit more than it would be in like a Dark Souls game previously, right? And so it's this very weird effect that I've had, particularly on repeat playthroughs or as I re-explore areas, of like, oh, here's this little region. And part of it is a compliment, because it means that they've done a really good job of creating cohesion within areas that lets me kind of grok them and group them together. And this is one of those weird things, though, that I've noticed, is like, you have not that many world regions, really. And so, like, you have Caelid, you have Limgrave, you have Liurnia, you have the Altus Plateau and Mount Gelmir, Lendel within that as well. And, like, Limgrave has the Weeping Peninsula and Stormhill. Caelid has the Aeonian Swamp, and then the area to the left of that, to the west of that, and then the Dragon Barrows to the north. The Altus Plateau technically is Lendel, the plateau itself, and then Mount Gelmir. And then you have the mountaintops of the Giants with the Consecrated Snowfield, and then the Farum Azula, and like, it's a decent list of areas. It's like 10 areas or something in terms of like major regions that they do a decent job of like being visually distinct and things like that, although the enemy distinction could be a little bit better in my opinion. But like, that's not terribly different than like Dark Souls 3 or even like Dark Souls 1, where you have Darkroot, the Undead Burg sort of area, the Blighttown area, the Demon Ruins, Catacombs, Tomb of the Giants, Anor Londo, the Painted World, You know, I'm there's a few more. The Duke's Archives, for example, the Undead Asylum is kind of sort of an area. So it's like there's a comparable ish thing. It's just there's a bit more going on in each of them, but they grok together very nicely. So like the world is it's this weird sort of thing where the world is easy to keep track of in some regards in terms of having very distinct regions and sections within it, which actually means that they do a really good job of making the world like being able to figure out where you are and stuff. And this is actually a really good thing, but on the other hand, it also has this weird effect where it feels kind of small. And it's this strange thing of like Guild Wars 1, even just Prophecies by itself feels like a bigger game world to me than Elden Ring. And I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. Some of that's movement speed, but there's other factors going in as well. So I don't know. I don't know how to interpret some of that. But something else that I noticed with Elden Ring is that the game is actually shockingly linear. This is some in terms of my experience with it. This is something that is maybe a bit weird, but for like an open world game. But as I've been thinking about it, there's a lot of things that contribute to this. So I touched on this a little bit earlier when I was talking about bosses, but because there's a boss-centered design, the world is designed to funnel you towards bosses. And the effect of this is that there's a strong sense of flow. And this is something that I really noticed more on like the second and especially third playthrough. So it's not like an initial problem exactly. But this is kind of a greater point and something that I'm kind of thinking about, and I like to try to understand from my own game design knowledge. So there's a couple of different factors that go into here. One of them is world arrangement. One of them is something that I call hubs and crossroads, which is kind of part of world arrangement and kind of not. And then there's also like this direction of movement where you're being funneled towards bosses. So because the game funnels you towards bosses, once you've beaten the boss of an area, you've kind of cleared that area and you don't really have a reason to go back. So the game is designed around directing you towards bosses. And to some extent, like overworld bosses kind of break this up a little bit, but the end result is that levels are designed to be advanced in specific directions because there is a sense of advancing. Like that word by itself sort of explains what's going on to an extent. So you really experience this with legacy dungeons in particular. And so if we back up, my main point of comparison, and this is something where I'm looking at an evolution in the design of that From Software has. Dark Souls 1, especially the first half, is very good about having loops. So there's a couple of different things that affect this. One of it is fast travel. Dark Souls 1, you don't get fast travel until like halfway through the game, 2/3 of the way through the game, depending upon how you want to kind of measure it. And then once you get fast travel, there's very specific places you can fast travel to. You can't just fast travel to any bonfire, unlike any grace in Elden Ring. Or any bonfire in Dark Souls 2 and 3 as well. Dark Souls 2 and 3 have this as well. And Demon Souls is also very much so like, okay, here's an area and there's a boss at the end of it. You're trying to get to that boss. So Dark Souls 1, we didn't know it at the time when we were playing it, but it's an outlier in terms of its world arrangement and things like that. So world arrangement has to do with how the various parts of the world are attached to each other, by the way. And this is something that I'll touch on more in a bit. But Dark Souls 1 has a very looped-based design where as you go, you open up connections between world regions, world zones, that allow you to be able to connect more of the world together. So if you're trying to get from point A to point B, the routes that you have to take to get through those kind of expand as you go. And so you have different paths you can take. This is particularly notable at the start of Dark Souls 1, where if you have the Master Key, you open up a lot more options in terms of ways that you can go. But even without it, like there's multiple ways down into Blighttown. You can go through the depths and that whole path, which is sort of the long path, or you can take the back path through the Valley of Drakes. And being able to go through the Valley of Drakes is a much quicker path down, although you miss a bunch of stuff in the process. if you're kind of going that way. But it affords you multiple ways to get through the areas. But as they've gone on, From Software has indicated through their games and their design that this is not something they're interested in. They're not really interested in making open worlds, such as it is. And Elden Ring presents the idea of an open world, but it's not as open as it appears. And this is actually something that I tweeted. It's a thought that I've had. I think Breath of the Wild does a much better job of being specifically an open world game than Elden Ring. I think Elden Ring does a lot of things that I like better than Breath of the Wild, but in terms of being an open world, I think Breath of the Wild does a better job. And it has to do with some of these factors. So, let's get into what these are in more detail. So, world arrangement. How is the world put together? How are the different pieces connected? In Elden Ring, the world is shaped like a giant C. You have, which hand is going to be best to demonstrate this? This hand. Woo, maybe. I don't know. So you have Limgrave, and it curls around to Caelid, and then it curls around the other way to Liurnia. That curls up to the Altus Plateau, which then connects kind of like Mount Gelmir and stuff, although that's technically part of the Altus Plateau, and then Mountaintop of the Giants. And then there's a couple of ancillary spots sticking off the end, like the Halig Tree in Farum Azula. There's also the underground areas, but those are also kind of connected in very specific linear ways. In other words, these world regions have very discrete points of connection. You can't get directly to Caelid from Liurnia. You can't get directly to it from anywhere but Limgrave. There are 2 warps in Limgrave. The elevator trap, the treasure chest trap in the lake in the middle of it, in Igil's Lake. That will take you into Caelid. And then there's the warp near the Third Church of Marika that takes you to right by Gronk, the Beast Clergyman's area. Which means that you actually have more points in terms of diversity of location of entrance into Caelid than just about anywhere else. The Altus Plateau has a couple of alternate ways in as well. There's up through the ruin-strewn precipice area with the worm Makar. There's the Dectus Elevator, which is the easiest way once you know where the 2 parts are, in my opinion. Or there's the very obscure way that Patches tells you about that warps you into the bottom of the Volcano Manor. That lets you get into those areas. But like if you're going into Liurnia, you're doing that from a specific point in Limgrave. There's not broad regions of connection, right? You're going from just past Stormvale Castle. You can't get to it from anywhere else from Limgrave. If you're going to the Altus Plateau, you have to go through Liurnia. If you're going to Caelid, you have to go from Limgrave. If you're going to the mountaintops of the Giants, it really is restrictive in terms of ways to get there. The overall effect of this is that the world is not actually that connected. It's not actually that open. Compare this to something like Breath of the Wild, where there are there's world regions, but they don't have narrow borders between them. They don't have narrow points of connection. And they have multiple things that they abut as well. So if you look at Hyrule Field, like the Hyrule area, it connects to basically everywhere. It connects up to Elden, down and towards the Hateno. There's Faron with multiple areas. Because you can climb over stuff as well, there's the roads, which provide sort of directed paths, but you can kind of go however you want to get to various places. And that's just not the case in Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, the world is very discrete sections that are discretely linked at discrete points in this specific C shape. The ways that you get around Mount Gelmir is another really good example. There's the upper area where the Volcano Manor is, and then there's the lower Seathwater area that wraps around the Volcano Manor spot. Altus Plateau has a decent number of like little areas within it, but hopefully I'm making my point. Like, it's a very visually stunning thing, but the world itself is not broad and open. It's not like Caelid does not connect to multiple areas. it would be very interesting to see an Elden Ring world designed more like Breath of the Wild, where you had the Altus Plateau in the middle and the other areas connecting around it, and having multiple points where you could get up to the Altus Plateau that were distributed across it, right? What does it look like for Caelid to adjourn Liurnia, or for Caelid, like, looking down from the Altus Plateau down on Caelid? Like, there's different arrangements that would have led to different points of connection, different borders, and I think that would have been interesting, and it would have been a bit more open. So this world arrangement inherently limits the openness of the world, because you have to propagate it through very specific paths, very specific directions. It has very specific routes through. So that's one of the things, and this is somewhat connected to the RPG elements, but the RPG elements in Souls games have always been able to be overcome through skill to an extent, although spending runes on leveling up your weapons instead of your armor is another way of approaching things. So world arrangement is one big one, just in terms of the way the world's laid out. It inherently is more linear. The fact that it moves you towards bosses also factors into that, especially in legacy dungeons that very much so lack a sense of multi-directionality to them. The direction you go is towards the next boss, and that's it. And one of the things that I've really noticed as I've been playing it is it's very hallway based in legacy dungeons. So they cover up the hallways by making them look like different rooms. But if you think about it, it's like, why is this connected to this or that? Raya Lucaria would be mega inconvenient to actually study in as a student. It is very game level, like very obviously a game level. And that's not just like, I think that they have good level design, but it's designed in a way that feels like a game level and not like a place. And that's something that really stands out to me. And personally, I would prefer it to feel a bit more like a place, even at the cost of level design, if that makes sense. So the other big thing that contributes to feelings of linearity is a combination of like fast travel and then hubs and crossroads. So this is something where player convenience is being favored over immersion. I'm not sure if immersion is quite the right word, but this is something that I've been thinking about as well. So let's first start by defining hubs and crossroads. A hub is a spot where a player goes to do stuff. So this could be a place where there's a lot of good farming nearby or a lot of things to collect. So, for example, a common place that you'll visit in Elden Ring might be that first that one cliff edge, I should say, in the Mogwin area, where there's all of those Albinaurics that people like to farm. That's a really good rune farming spot, so you're going to go visit that a bunch to farm those runes. Another good example is in Dark Souls 1. You might farm Titanite chunks off of Dark Wraiths. So maybe you're going through that area a bunch. So you get really familiar with it. You spend a lot of time there. Elden Ring, like, there's definitely going to be some spots that are going to be farming hubs for players, but by and large, it's not a game that incentivizes farming a whole lot, I feel, which is fine. I don't think that's a bad thing. For things outside of runes, I should be clear. But, you might look for areas, like Shifra has some really good areas to go for farming animals, and there's some other spots as well that are good for that. So other things for hubs are like quest hubs. But here's the thing. Souls games traditionally have had very few quests. And like Elden Ring has a lot for a Souls game, but not for a traditional RPG. There's just not, like, an MMO is going to have questing hubs, places you keep going back to because new quests keep popping up and there's quest chains to do out of them and things like that. And you don't really have that with Elden Ring. You more have NPCs that you interact with that roam around the world a little bit. So, but there's not really like hubs per se. The other thing is like merchants. So EG, for example, might be a little bit of a hub for you if you haven't found certain somber stones. But like Dark Souls 1 has really good hubs because there's Andre, and the giant blacksmith makes for some really strong hubs. Points where you need to go back to for services. The other one is Crossroads. So like there's other things like merchant services and things like that make for good hubs. Merchants in Elden Ring are not really functioning that much in hub capacity though, because by and large, like maybe you're using a bow and you're using arrows and you're not crafting them, you're buying arrows, which the bought arrows are a bit better than crafted arrows, but not a ton better. So the biggest reason would be for great arrows and great bolts, which have very limited crafting capacity, which there's some good ones to buy off of merchants, I think. So that would be the main reason why you'd go back to visit specific merchants, because a lot of times it's just like, oh, I've bought the limited stock items that they have and the consumables I don't need to go back for because I can also just get them, like I can craft things in the crafting system that are just as good, right? Or significantly more convenient. So the crafting system kind of decreases the hub ability of merchants because there's no reason to go back to merchants for stuff a lot of times. So merchant services can function as a hub, and there's one that does, the Twin Maiden Husk, but that's in the hub area, right? So merchant services, craftsmen, and basically NPCs and farming are some of the big things that make a spot a hub, a place a player goes back to do things in that specific area. The other one is Crossroads, and these are areas that you travel through a lot to go back and forth. So a really good example of this is in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Hyrule Field is a crossroads because there's a lot of areas that connect to it, but so is the Lost Woods, because the Lost Woods connects Sacred Forest Meadow area where there's a fast travel point. Fast travel has huge impacts on Crossroads. Kokiri, and then it connects to Kokiri Forest, Goron City, and Zora River right by the entrance to Zora's domain. So that serves as a crossroads. It is a place that you'll go to and you'll travel through a bunch because it is convenient. These sorts of crossroads, another example from Dark Souls 1, Firelink Shrine serves as a hub and a crossroad, but so does the Undead Parish area right by Andre. That connects to Darkroot, the broader undead areas such as Undead Burg, Firelink Shrine, as well as Sun's Fortress. So that is a huge crossroads area. It is a place that you'll travel through back and forth a bunch as you're trying to get to different parts of the map. Elden Ring, by and large, does not have a whole lot of hubs or crossroads. The main reason to go back to an area is to pick up something you missed. And that's kind of it. Once you've done all the things you missed, there's not really a reason to go back for a lot of cases. Most of the things that you'd want from a hub are all centered in the stronghold, the round table hold area, and that's kind of that. Like, you have your reinforcement there, you have your merchant there that you turn your bell bearings into. That really has the main repeatable purchases that you care about. EG kinda is a pseudo hub in that you could go visit him to do weapon upgrades. There's the weapon upgrade area near Kale, but that's super limited, and why would you use that once you have access to Hugh anyway? There's a few spellcaster merchants. You visit the Ronnie area a bunch for quest reasons, so that's kind of a quest hub. But by and large, there's not a whole lot of crossroads or hubs in the game, and that just really limits the sense of spending time in a place. The value of hubs and crossroads are they keep you spending time in a place. They keep you revisiting a place, and that helps to break up the sense of linearity when you go back to places. So I just, there's a picture of an alternate form of Elden Ring where very early on, like Altus Plateau and Lindell is an early area. You get there like a quarter of the way through the game, and Lindell is not entirely ruined, and there's merchant services there. That's where that becomes a major hub where you go back to spend a lot of time. That's where you have various merchants that you can buy various consumables and other important materials from, where you can get some cool weapons. where you can trade in boss weapons and stuff. Like that could be really cool as a hub. And then you get towards the end of the game, and it turns into the Ashen Lendel, and everyone's scattered, and you have to go figure out where all of your NPCs went. Like this is a very different experience. It's less convenient for the player when this happens, but like we get a little taste of it, right? When Roderica moves from her spot to go stand in the first area where she was, like her service is still there, but she's moved, right? This sort of thing where NPCs like that would make Ashen Capital a way more impactful transition than it already is. Like it is already an impactful transition, but that'd make an even bigger one. And it'd mean that there's more to do in Lendel. There's more reason to spend time there. Things like that could be really interesting and lead to a very different experience. But it is what it is that they've done. I would prefer something a bit different in this regard, though, and hopefully I've kind of explained that a good bit. The only other thing I had under exploration specifically is the 4 belfries and the imbued keys. It's kind of a weird mechanic. It's a neat way to preview some areas with getting kind of that different view of Nokron. And Farah Missoula in particular was really, really cool. I think the enemies in those preview areas are calibrated a little difficult. And it's a good way to get you back to the starting spot. I'm not entirely sure, though, why the Precipice of Anticipation area exists. It feels like a holdover. It really, really does. Because you go there to get killed by a boss, probably. And then you can go back for a few things. But, like, the tutorial isn't there. It's not, like, in Dark Souls 1, you have the tutorial in the Undead Asylum, and then you leave it, and then you can come back later. In Dark Souls 2, you have it in Things Betwixt. In Dark Souls 3, you have it leading up to Firelink Shrine. All of these areas serve as tutorials, but the tutorial is not in the starting area for some random reason. And so it feels really vestigial, and I'm not quite sure why it's there. But that's not to say that's a bad thing. It's just a confusing thing in terms of like, okay, what's the overall design reason why this is here? What purpose is it serving to the greater design? And I'm not entirely sure at this point. It's just the Precipice of Anticipation area is just so minimal that it doesn't give a good sense of why it's there, because it's not. It feels like it's there to be like the segregated tutorial areas that previous Souls games have had, without actually serving that purpose. And I think that's very strange. So that's kind of my big discussion on exploration. We are now very far into this very long video. So this brings us to Miscellaneous. So there's a bunch of different things here that we're going to cover. Don't worry. We're going to spend a lot of time in lore, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so Miscellaneous. First things first, Turtle Shield being the stamina regen shield is brilliant. I love that it makes you look like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle when you two-hand. I think this is really cool. There has traditionally been a stamina regen shield, Grass Crest Shield. There's a couple of different ones in Dark Souls 2, Grass Crest Shield again in Dark Souls 3. Because that's the sort of thing Dark Souls 3 was doing. But we get the Turtle Shield in this one, and this is such a good idea. I love this so much. Being able to slap this on your back when you two-hand your main weapon, and it looking like you have a turtle shell. I love it. So good. Such a good idea. Wandering Mausoleums. I think these are great, and the ability to duplicate remembrances is fantastic. For that first playthrough, especially with how big of a game it is, I think that's super cool. There is a weird timing issue that I have with it, though. There are a lot of bosses that drop remembrances, but most of them are later in the game. But a lot of the mausoleums are actually earlier on. There's the one in the Weeping Peninsula, and then there's the 3 in Liurnia area, one at the bottom of the cliff, and then the 2 higher up, that for some reason can't do all of the remembrance types, those higher ones. I don't know why. That's a weird decision. There are 3 more that are later on, for a total of 7. But the timing of this is really weird in that you get so few remembrances earlier on, and I kind of got the feeling that the result of this is that I didn't quite understand how the mechanic worked, and I kind of thought the mausoleums were linked to specific bosses, where like, oh, this is Godric's mausoleum that lets you duplicate his, and this one's the one that lets you duplicate Renala's, and this is the one that lets you duplicate Radon's, and this was the one that lets you duplicate Estelle. But that's not how it works at all. So I wasted some mausoleums on my first character, which was a big bummer. I did not need both Waves of Darkness and Nebula on my Strength Faith character. Waves of Darkness I could use, but Nebula I can't. That character's probably never going to use Nebula. Or use Bastard Stars. That's the name. I was naming it after the weapon art. So it's like, I didn't understand, and it took a long time for that character to get Dex as well. Enough Dex to use Godric's axe as well as the Dragon Fist. And I like the Dragon Fist. Dragon Fist is cool. So I like that there are quite a few remembrances that do the boss soul thing. I like the boss soul mechanic. I still think the boss soul mechanic was... I don't know. I liked it better in... There's a lot of things that Dark Souls 1 did that I like better, but we'll get to that later. So I don't know. I like the idea of mausoleums. I just wish I understood how the mechanic worked a bit better before I wasted some on things that I didn't care about, without realizing how limited of a supply they were and how plentiful remembrances would be, because there's a lot more remembrances, like I said, later in the game, but I didn't realize that because I went in super not knowing things. So I know that's some thoughts. Good mechanic, could use a little bit of polish, a little bit better understanding of how things fit together. It did seem really weird to me how late all of the remembrances were, that there weren't more earlier, but I'm also okay with bosses just dropping specific weapons. I did have this experience, I think this is a good spot to stick it, in my first playthrough, maybe Exploration would have, but whatever, we're just right next to that, where I felt that there was a lot of interesting int weapons that I was running into or int and dex weapons, because the Strength Faith initial character, and I kept being disappointed that I couldn't play with them. But as I played with some of those other ones, I discovered that no, there's a lot of really cool strength weapons and a lot of really cool faith weapons as well. It's just you don't realize the things that you have when you have things that you don't have, if that makes sense. Anyway. Another thing is I'm glad that there's bell-bearing hunters for a bunch of useful things to be able to buy. But I do wish there was one with foul, like a foul hunter's bell bearing that had feathers and feet, because getting flight pinions and four-toed feet is a pain in the butt. Stormhawk feathers could also have been on that, so that would have been kind of nice for some of those. But it's nice that they have those that you can do. Next miscellaneous item is invisible floors were awful in Dark Souls 1, and they remain awful in Elden Ring. They worked in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask because the Lens of Truth exists, but it doesn't here. I will add that I think that the invisible floors get less bad as you learn how they work through repeat playthroughs, but they still kind of suck. I just don't like the invisible floors. They keep doing them, and I keep not liking them. At least there's none. So the Crystal Caves one to get to the blue Titanite slab in Dark Souls 1 is absolutely atrocious. They do a better job of communicating where they're at in Elden Ring. In particular, there's two main areas where I think of there being invisible floors. The one tower where the Founding Rain of Stars is. That took me a while to figure out because it's not in a spot where I was expecting it, being kind of opposite the thing. There is kind of a visual effect that you can sort of see for seeing where that path is. And then the other one has doorways that's inside the Path to the Halig Tree catacomb area. So that one has good like doorways to line you up. So they do some stuff that makes it easier to kind of figure out where they are, but I still don't like them. Okay, so I have... This is a longer point, and we'll connect into some stuff. The location of the upgrade material bell bearings that let you buy infinite upgrade materials all feel kind of late to me. So this goes back into the things I was talking about earlier with... I just feel like the smithing stone requirements for regular weapons are really late, and then the ability to get somber stones and gloveworts, both grave and ghost, is like really spotty. I really wish they hadn't made those tiered. I just wish that it cost more per tier. Having them tiered encourages you to explore a wider variety of weapons. Having them like Twinkling Titanite, where it's just like you need more per level, would have meant that you wouldn't run into these bottlenecks that I kept running into. And then regular smithing stones, I feel, are just too friggin' rare, especially higher tier ones. And the problem with this is when you find new cool weapons or spirits to use, you've already invested in stuff, so it locks you into your investment in a way that can work, but when you find new stuff means that you have to be able to reinvest that. And I went into more detail in my specific video about upgrades, but I wrote down some of the locations. So the regular smithing stones is in the Ray Lucaria Crystal Tunnel for the 1 and 2 stones. 3 and 4s are in the Seal Tunnel and the Altus Plateau. Zamor Ruins in the Mountaintop of the Giants for 5 and 6 stones, so you're already pretty far of the way through the game when you can finally get to that one. And then the 7 and 8 stones are locked behind the Goskin Duo and Farum Azula. And I think those are all like an area later than I'd put them. So I would ideally put the endless ancient smithing stones, the Titanite shard or Titanite slab variant, in Farum Azula. That's where I'd put bell bearings for those, or maybe in New Game Plus. But I'd probably have the 1 and 2 stone as a reward somewhere in Limgrave, and then just like basically move everything up a notch. So the Altus Plateau would have a 5 and 6 stone somewhere that you could get. Ray Lucaria. Basically, I'd have the stones that you're getting as rewards. I think towards the end, throughout that zone, I think you should get the bell bearing for unlimited quantities at the end of that area. Caelid is kind of a weird case, though. It's kind of off to the side, and this is a weird thing with the world layout in general, because the world's actually quite linear in a lot of its design. Having that off to the side means that you're trying to slot it in a weird spot, and Dragon Barrows is a much later game area that's like Mountaintop of the Giants equivalent, whereas the lower part of it is kind of more Altus Plateau-y, late Liurnia level. So it's just kind of weirdly assorted. Somber Stone, it's the Celia Crystal Tunnel that you get warped to in Caelid that has the 1 and 2 stones. And then Altus Tunnel for 3 and 4 stones. And then 5 and 6 is not until Mountaintop of the Giants, near the first Church of America, the Mountaintop of the Giants. And then the 7 and 8 is in Farum Azula. And then it's later in Farum Azula that you can get 9 stones. I just feel, again, that these are a bit late. I'm not sure the ideal place for some of these, but I kind of feel like the 3 and 4 maybe could be in Caelid. In general, like having to wait until you get to the Mountaintop of the Giants for 5 and 6 stones just feels super late for Somber. I know that they're trying to kind of put things in equivalent spots with them, but it's still, in general, I feel like getting the smithing stones is later than it ought to be. And I feel like getting regular stones is more expensive than it ought to be, because it just limits your ability to experiment with different weapons, and that's part of what's fun about the game. And it's hard to get a sense for an unupgraded weapon because its damage is always going to be poor compared to yours. Of course, different people are going to have different ideas about balance. I just would prefer these to be more available. Grave Glovewort, the 1 to 3, the very first one, isn't until Windham Catacombs in the Altus Plateau. The 4 to 6 isn't until the Giants Mountaintop Catacombs in Mountaintop of the Giants, and then Farum Azula near the Wormface for the 7 to 9. These are all super late. Now, there is a conflict of interest here. This is one of the things that's really difficult about game design. They want you to be rewarded with Glovewort for like exploring catacombs to reward you with Glovewort and to reward you with smithing stones. Making them purchasable undervalues those rewards, but it doesn't obviate them. Like, it doesn't get rid of them to be able to purchase them, because getting them for free is still valuable. Like, the fact that I can buy a 9 stone for 25 grand doesn't change the fact that picking one up is still really useful, because they cost 25 grand. So those rewards are still really good, even if you can buy them. And the thing is, being able to buy... And Windham Catacombs, I should add, is an area that's really easy to overlook. it's kind of tucked away in an area that's a little bit hard to find in the first place. I could totally expect somebody missing the whole Seathwater area. And like I spent a long time scratching my head trying to figure out how to get to there from the Volcano Manor area. And I found the friggin' ladder up to that part of Mount Gelmir. So, I just didn't see the slight ramp up to where the Wyndham Ruins area is. So the Wyndham Catacombs is very, very late for that. And again, like if this had been available somewhere in Limgrave, which I don't think is unreasonable, I wouldn't have gotten bottlenecked on one Gravewort ones, right? But I did because the spot to be able to buy unlimited of them, it comes so late in the game. Ghost Glovewort. So this is the thing, right? The Ghost Glovewort is in Nokron in a gazebo after beating Radon for the first one. And then it's not in Noxtella and then Elphael, which is pretty late, but that's fine. I don't mind those ones being later, though those are both pretty late locations. I like having a good reward in Elphael, though, like that. And then Noxtella, there's a side room guarded by Silver Tears that has the 4 to 6. Like, I found that one, the Ghost Glovewort one. I was rolling in Ghost Glovewort, first of all, because Ghost Glovewort's a bit easier to find, in my opinion, just because it's in the lower underground areas. But, like, that one I found before I found the Grave Glovewort one. So it's like, because here's the thing, is this game, Elden Ring has this weird thing where I feel like the special things, somber weapons and ghost glovewort, so the legendary spirits or wrist spirits or whatever we'll call them, I feel like those are easier to upgrade, to find upgrade materials for, than the regular versions, than regular smithing stones, than regular gravewort, or regular grave glovewort. And so it's just like this weird effect where I'm like, I feel like I'm supposed to be favoring regular weapons and regular spirits, but it's actually easier for me to find the upgrade materials for the other ones, for the unique stuff. And that feels really weird to me. So, it's kind of a bit of a strange experience that I've had with it. To an extent on initial playthrough, but especially on repeat playthroughs. So I just feel like some of those purchasable things should just be available earlier. Or use a different system where, because this is one of those things, is like Dark Souls, Twinkling Titanite. I know I keep going back to this, but Twinkling Titanite was fairly limited, so you really had to pick what you were investing in. But that made those weapons more special, and then you had a lot more of the regular upgrade materials to upgrade regular weapons. So it's like the availability that you make for those upgrade materials really dictates sort of the weapons that players are going to gravitate towards, because they're going to gravitate towards things that they can upgrade more easily. And if you're creating sunk costs for switching. So there's a cost to switching to a new weapon that a player may find. So weapons that you find later in the game, like the cane sword, like, are you going to switch to the cane sword because you think it's neat? Well, what if you've already invested in the Lordsworn sword? Like, you're not going to try the cane sword just because you think it's neat if you don't have the materials to make it worth your while, if you're going to make the game harder by switching to a less upgraded weapon. So I've had strong thoughts about the Souls reinforcement systems for quite some time, and this game really brings them all to the fore. So I feel like the ability to buy infinite versions was a bit too late, or they should have gone with a different system. That, like, Gravewort and Ghostwort instead of these Glovewort things. It's like, oh, you need to use Gravewort to upgrade regular spirits and Ghostwort to upgrade these ones. But it's like, okay, instead of having tiered versions, if it's like, okay, I need 1 to upgrade it the first time, and 2 to upgrade it that time, and all the way up to 10 to get to the final upgrade. Like, that would have been fine and would have gotten rid of the issue and would have meant that I'm specifically wanting to invest in certain ones, but it would also mean that, different results from different mechanics, and there's pros and cons to the different ways that they've handled things. Kind of what the end result is. Next thing under Miscellaneous, the Deathblight condition effect is really cool looking. Just a neat note. I think this is cool. Erupt. I already touched on this one. So my next thing in the list was just the button that opened the map doesn't close it, being something that kept tripping up. Less with time, though, as I got used to it. The addition of the effect that plays when an enemy that you've killed has dropped an item is a really good addition. So for those who didn't pick up on this, there's kind of a bluish colored effect that sprouts from an enemy when you kill it, and it will have an item that you can pick up. So you know to wait for that enemy's death animation to finish so you can actually loot it. Otherwise, like in previous Souls games, you would kill an enemy and then you could easily run on not knowing that it dropped something, or you'd wait to see if they dropped something. So this game having an effect that plays when they will have something to loot from them when their death animation finishes was a really nice bit of feedback, a really nice touch. Something that I personally was able to pick up on very quickly. I don't know how quickly people are able to make to come to an understanding of that or to identify what it meant, but it's definitely something that I liked and really appreciated. So I'm really glad that they added that. That's something that was a really good addition. Next point. Scarabs making the same sound regardless of type was frustrating. I stand by that. So there are, broadly speaking, 5 types of scarabs, I think. There are Somber Stone scarabs. There are Ash of War scarabs. There are spell scarabs, which come in incantation and miracle varieties. Incantation ones are yellowy, and spell ones are pretty rare, but sorcery ones are kind of a blue tinge. There are crimson tear scarabs, and there are cerulean scarabs, which look very similar to the sorcery scarabs. Hearing the scarab sound was always there's something cool nearby that I want to go get. Somber Stones are all right. They're playing in the same space as crystal lizards from previous games. I drop our favorite Twinkling Titanite. But the flask scarabs respawn, notably. So I was always excited to get more Ashes of War or spells. Somber Stones are kind of like a nice, another second tier thing to get. But I didn't really care about the flask scarabs. But the fact that all of these scarabs make the same sound means that I'm, especially on my first playthrough when I didn't know where things were or wasn't looking up where things were, I was, wanting to look around for, okay, where's this scarab? Where's this thing that I'm looking for that I want? So, and then whenever I found it was a flask scarab, I was always disappointed because, I'd at least take a Somber Stone as a constellation prize. And sometimes those are really freaking good constellation prizes when they're like 7+ stones. Those are pretty rare, so it was really nice to find one of those. If it's a 2 or 4 stone, it is less exciting because those are much more plentiful. But yeah, so I wish they made a different sound. In general, I like the idea of the flask restoring scarabs. I generally found that I didn't need them a whole lot just because if I was doing enough fighting that I was getting low on resources, I was either going to be resting aside of Grace real soon, or the enemy mobs that I just killed would restore most of my flasks. But I think the idea of the scarabs was a good mechanic. I just wish that there was different sounds for the flask restoring ones than the other types, so I wouldn't get confused about what I'm looking for. The next one. The fact that death resets the time of day to the morning, which I had to learn from the internet, instead of advancing it, as I'd originally assumed, is very weird and terrible in trying to fight night bosses. Those are 2 separate thoughts, by the way. It's very weird that it resets to morning, no matter when it was that you died, as opposed to advancing it some amount, which I believe some of the mods now can just advance it by a certain amount, which is the behavior I'd expect, quite frankly. That's the behavior I expected it to do. But it's also terrible when you're trying to fight night bosses, when you kill a night boss and then you have to reset to nighttime again, past time outside of Grace to make it night. So it was just, that's just weird, and I don't know why they did it that way. Next miscellaneous point. The menu putting combat important consumables, such as condition healing items, near the top with default ordering was a really good choice. Yep. So the fact that I can just pull up my inventory and very quickly get to, like, Ashes of War is one notch. No, Spirit Ashes is a one notch over. Um, I really like the Spirit Ash system, by the way. I think that's a really cool idea and a really neat way of complementing the idea of summons. The fact that you can have them with NPC summons too is really nice, although I know they don't stack with player summons. I think this is just a really good system. I love how many different ones there are. Um, yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say. Really cool idea. I really like it, and I'd love to see it again in the future. Being able to have enemies that ally with you in that way is really neat. Uh, awesome system. Um, so the fact that those are really close from the inventory menu is nice. But the fact if when you pull up the inventory, um, it's very quick to get down to condition healing items with the default sorting, also really good. And I really appreciate that. It means that if you encounter a condition that you weren't expecting to have it on like your hotbar somewhere, you can still quickly get to something to take care of it. And that I really appreciate. Um, Tailoring is a neat system. There's not a whole lot that you can do with it. Mostly remove capes, which makes stuff slightly less defensive but slightly lighter and changes the appearance. I really like how Millennia's chest piece changes when you take the cape off, by the way. But there's a number of them like that. I think that's a really cool system. I really like the addition of it. It would be neat to see them expand it with things like a dyeing system that would let you be able to change the color of armors and stuff like that. But this is a really cool initial step, and I'm glad that they added it. And there's definitely a lot of like additional stuff needed to kind of go into that, but I think this is really cool. Conditions. I like the assortment of conditions. I am annoyed that Madness and Deathblight basically don't affect any enemies. It would have been cool to be able to make builds with that in mind, and the fact that you really can't because most enemies are immune. I think some more human-like enemies can be affected by Madness. I don't know if there's any enemies in the game that can be affected by Deathblight. Maybe some very human-type summons. But the fact that those are basically useless is a real bummer. And really unfortunate, but I like the assortment of conditions. Bleed is obviously strong. Frostbite is very similar to Bleed, but has additional stuff going on. Poison and Rot are fairly similar to each other, but that's pretty typical to have Poison and then Toxic. So I feel like they did a good job of like making the conditions feel relevant overall, but it is, and Sleep is super strong. I'm surprised more enemies don't do Sleep. I'm glad Madness and Deathblight are somewhat more limited because those are really nasty. I do wish more enemies could. I do wish enemies could generally be afflicted by Madness and Deathblight though, and the fact that they can't is a bit disappointing. I like that there's as much variety in conditions as they have as well, and that there's different ways of kind of interacting with some of them. New Game Plus. I'm just slapping this in here. So this is past Miscellaneous into a new category, New Game Plus. This is something that I wanted to explore a little bit because New Game Plus is something that's been fairly relevant to the Soul series. It's particularly important with the boss-centric design since once you've killed the boss of an area, there doesn't tend to be a whole lot of reason to go there. Like, areas exist to be things for you to explore through to get to bosses, not for other purposes generally. That's just a consequence of the design of how these games are structured. So I appreciate that there's New Game Plus that you can go through. So New Game Plus in this game, I like that you keep a bunch of key items, crafting recipes, torrent, the bell bearings that don't create additional menus at the Twin Maiden Husks. So that's like your gravity stones and your meats and your medicines, but also your reinforcement materials, which is really key. I remember Dark Souls 3 going into New Game Plus could get you more souls, so you could afford those reinforcement materials more easily, but it also meant that you had to go all the way through like almost the entire game to be able to get to Arc Dragon Peak to get the final tier of purchasing of those, or going through most of the game to unlock Cloan's inventory in Dark Souls 2, for example. So having those, like keeping those in the Twin Maiden husks is really nice, and I do appreciate it. Not having to refind all of your crafting recipes and all of your containers as well, and keeping all that stuff is really nice. It does mean that there's fewer things to loot in the world because you keep those, but I'll take that. So that really nice. I understand why you lose great runes, but it also kind of sucks. So when you go into New Game Plus, any great runes that you found, so that's Godric's, Morgoth's, etc., you have to refine those. It makes a lot of sense from like the game is kind of structured around needing to find great runes and things like that. It would have been interesting if you had been able to keep them for a couple of reasons. One, so that way if you wanted to play through the game with like Millennia's rune in particular, that one creates the most difference in playstyle because of the regain mechanic that you gain access to. The fact that you have to like beeline it to a hard boss to be able to get it in the new game means that you don't have as much of the game to be able to play through with it on, which is kind of a bummer. But I also understand, like, I don't know. I think it would have been fine though to have Lendel open right from the beginning. It doesn't really change that much of the game to have them available for you to start with them. So I'm kind of torn on this. So I kind of understand why they would want you to lose them, but it also kind of sucks, like I said. And it'd be nice to be able to kind of start with them. Something that I've noticed as well is, like, I haven't beaten the game on New Game Plus, but it's clear that they didn't do anything. I have not run anything special for being a New Game Plus. There's just like, you get to keep a bunch of things. It's like, okay, that's nice, but there's no like special things. They didn't replace anything. So like Dark Souls 2 added a bunch of new stuff when you went to the New Game Plus. Dark Souls 3 added new soul items. So soul item pickups were replaced for ones that were typically more valuable. That sort of thing. Dark Souls 1 didn't have as much, but again, your Estus Flask, you couldn't fully reinforce in New Game. You had to do it in New Game Plus. So I can understand why Elden Ring doesn't have new stuff, given how big it is, but it's still a little disappointing not to have anything fancy added. On the other hand, it is really nice to be able to play through the game with a finished build that I'm just polishing instead of trying to put a build together. To be able to play through the game with, you know, the assortment of weapons that I've collected and all that sort of stuff, that is really nice. And it's nice to be able to go through with the fashion that I like. And so I really appreciate that and enjoy that. So it's a little bit of give and take in that regard. So I've generally avoided taking characters into New Game Plus, by the way, in part because it's just easier to put together a build when it doesn't cost a lot to rearrange stuff. And you can respec, but I prefer not to. I like to have characters have their distinct like build personalities and stuff, and I don't want to be shifting that around. So I haven't done any respecking, and that's not something I'm really interested in. Though I'm glad that they have the option. But I also knew that DLC was coming, and I didn't want to have a bunch of characters in New Game Plus, multiple New Game Plus cycles that I was going into that for the first time. So I just took my very first character that I'd been most thorough of making sure I'd gotten everything on into New Game Plus. And that's the character that most needed to benefit from it as well, because I missed a bunch of NPC quests. Which brings us to our next thing, NPC quests. I appreciate that they're generally more forgiving in Elden Ring than in previous ones. Friggin' Sigmire in Dark Souls 1 being especially notable. That one's super easy to not get all the way to the end. There's good rewards as well. I do wish they didn't put upgrade materials behind it, particularly that Somber Stone behind Millennia and Millicent's quest. Again, upgrade materials, I don't mind like incidental upgrade materials. It's the ones that are in limited quantity where it's like, okay, I feel like I have to finish this NPC quest in order to be able to get the upgrade material because I want to be able to max my weapons out. I am glad that you don't have reinforcement for armor, but they didn't do that in Dark Souls 3 either, so it's not a new change. So, you know, that's a little frustrating because what happens when I feel like I need to do an NPC quest in order to be able to get those final tier limited quantity upgrade materials is it turns it into a checklist of like, okay, I have to do Millicent's quest even though and beat Millennia in order to be able to get, this limited quantity of reinforcement material. I find that really frustrating, and that's not something that I like because I don't like turning it into like something I have to do where it's a chore. But I do like what's going on with the NPC quests. I think they do some really interesting stuff. I think the NPCs are pretty compelling. Alexander's awesome. Something else that I really like is I like how many of them intersect. So, for example, Ronnie and Fia have overlap, where Fia needs the curse mark from Ronnie in order to be able to get that. So you have to go through Ronnie's quest, and there's multiple entrances into Ronnie's quest as well, whether you go there with Rajier's prompting or if you go there just on your own. That changes the tenor of how that plays out, and I think that's really cool. I like how Alexander goes to the Radon Festival for his own reasons, and Blythe goes there for his own reasons. And it creates a bit of a more of a world. It makes the world feel more connected. It makes it feel more alive, such as it is. Like Souls games have proportionately very few NPCs compared to something like a Skyrim or your traditional RPG. But they get a lot of mileage out of them, and Elden Ring amps that up a lot. So Patches intersects in a number of areas and is handled in interesting ways, mostly along Volcano Manor, but still, like, he intersects in that in interesting ways. A lot of stuff, like Ronnie's questline has fingers in lots of different pies, with Sylvis in lots of different ways that he can interact and intersect with, because of his potion. And I don't know, there's just a lot of ways in which things from one NPC's quest interact with things from another NPC's quest. And I think that's really cool, and I like how that works. And that's something that I appreciate. So I think they did a good job with that. And let's move on. Next category, music. Not a whole lot that I want to say here. Just Souls games have traditionally been light on music, and I appreciate that Elden Ring isn't. Just large areas to kind of explore. It has really good ambient tracks for setting mood during your wanderings around the world. Boss music is still the same sort of like strong energy stuff that they've done, but they did a really good job with the ambient stuff. I love Lendel in particular. The just visuals, the ambiance. My favorite like singular area in the game is that courtyard at the base of the Divine Bridge, just next to the fortified manor, where there's a couple of iron virgins which suck, but when you're in like that courtyard itself, just it feels like a really nice little quiet secret place in the music. And I love Lendel overall, though. It's an area that really speaks to my sense of aesthetics, and the music does such a good job of like feeding into that. So I was not expecting the soundtrack that Elden Ring has, so I was really surprised because most of the Souls games only have music on boss battles, and like maybe the hub. So like you're playing Dark Souls 3 and there's not random music for, I don't know, trying to remember any of the place names in that place, the High Wall of Lothric, or whatever the swamp happened to be called in that one. The Catacombs of Karthus don't have a theme. It's just Firelink Shrine and bosses, right? And that's traditionally been, and like, that's what made Shrine of Amana so special in Dark Souls 2, is suddenly had this diegetic music going on from the Milfinitos singing, and or to some extent the Demon of Song at the end of it. And I love the Majula theme. It's like Souls games have often had music that I really liked, but I was not expecting to have the area, the ambient tracks, and battle music and stuff like that for different zones. So I appreciated the addition of the greater breadth of music, and I really like Elden Ring's offerings in that regard. Okay, and lore is the final thing before a wrap up. So I really like what the lore is doing. In general, Miyazaki games have an overall theme of the old order not letting go, where there's this sense of the world is coming to an end. It should have ended. The current order should have ended. Elden Ring does it a bit differently than the Dark Souls trilogy, which is the one that I really know. Um, but Dark Souls has this idea of the Age of Fire should have ended, and we're trying to perpetuate it and drag it out, and that just gets hammered more and more with Dark Souls 2 and especially Dark Souls 3, which is really like, boy, we are running on ashes here. Like that's the entire idea. Elden Ring very much so maintains that idea of there's something fundamentally flawed at the heart of the Golden Order, and it should have ended and been replaced a long time ago, but it's limping along, and you're finally the one who comes here to take care of it. I still really appreciate lore channels, in particular. Vadi Vidya is the real popular one. Hawkshaw, I think, is the right name. Yes. There's too many people I know with similar names that I get myself a little confused. And then, of course, Zuli the Witch with some behind-the-scenes stuff, getting out little details. But Hawkshaw does an especially good job of going super deep. Vadi is your, I don't know, your production value, high production value, good, broad overview. And Hawkshaw goes really, really deep into nitty-gritty, like a lengthy video digging into how color, like what color means in Elden Ring, for example, and sort of the significance of that. So, like, lots of interesting details. But I like a lot of what the lore is doing here, once I kind of understood how everything kind of fit together. So, like, who are the Tarnished? Well, the Tarnished are the Warriors of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, or Horalu, if you want to call him that, who, after he did all of his conquering, he no longer had a place in the world, so he was divested of grace, and he and his warriors, and they became the Tarnished, were sent off to other lands, and then they were brought back over a long period of time to the lands between, to try to take care of the mess following the Shattering. So I'm not entirely sure if they showed up as the Shattering was happening or if it was after, but it was around that time that thing started. And so, like, you have this great sense of history, too, of like, okay, there's the great order of the initial Tarnished that arrived in the fortified manor, but that kind of died out as the age continued to unwind and unspin. So there's a lot of interesting stuff sort of that way, but the thing that I really like, particularly about the Elden Ring lore over Dark Souls lore especially, is the idea of these outer gods. And, like, you get this real sense that the events of Elden Ring are kind of small fry. That, like, as big and boisterous and significant as everything is in Elden Ring, you also get the sense that it is a proxy war and very small in the grand scheme of the contest of these gods, of the greater will and the whatever weird Mother Moga's worshipping, and the frenzied flame, the god connected to that, and whatever. Then there's whatever the Placidusix, whatever the dragon lord is trying to commune with. And then there's Rani and Renala with the moons, and the fell god of the giants. There's just this really interesting sense of these are deities that are influencing the world in very interesting ways that have indirect influence, and sort of this tier of gods and all that sort of stuff. I think that's really interesting, and they're doing a lot of interesting stuff with that. That is, like, you could make more games set in the Elden Ring universe without having to take place in the lands between, where it's different worlds where these conflicts are happening, different aspects of proxy wars of these various gods, the greater will and the moon and all these sorts of things, where these ideas could be explored in a different world very easily, where it doesn't have to feel like a retread. It's expanding the scope of what's going on. And the idea of this, like, is really interesting, where even when we're fighting the Elden Beast, that's not the greater will, that's a vassal, that's an emissary of the greater will, right? And it really has, I like the sense of scale and scope that it has, and we would have to be an entity on the Elden Beast level to begin really trying to fight the greater will, and we'd have to surpass where the Elden Beast is, in terms of an entity to be able to play in that space. And it's just doing some very interesting things that I really enjoy the sense of scale and the scope, and it really gets my imagination working, and I really appreciate that. So I really like what it's doing in that regard. Probably my biggest criticism of the lore is that there's too many very similar names that gets very confusing. Melina, America, Millennia. Um, I feel like I've said at least several different people there, but I don't know if I've gotten them confused. You have Ronnie and Renala and Radon and Rykard. Um, those I'm at least somewhat able to keep straight. Godefroy and Godric and Godfrey and Godwin. I cannot tell you, like, it was pretty late into the game that I realized Godfrey, First Elden Lord, and Godwin the Golden were two separate characters. Like, I got them super mega confused early on, just because their names are so similar. So that that's probably my biggest critique of the lore, is just the names being so similar is super confusing. I don't think it's that's not necessarily a judgment call, by the way. I'm not saying that's good or bad. But it is a thing to think about if you're making a lore of some kind, of what are you doing with the names? What are you doing to help people differentiate these characters, especially characters that are appearing very late in the game at best? Like, Godwin the Golden is absolutely in the game. Godfrey is in the game, but they're very late or not obvious in some regards. So, I don't know. But yeah, I overall really like what the lore is doing, and the Outer Gods concept is fascinating. And I would like to have Mikla explored a bit more. I do wish that there were alternatives. So, like, in Santier's, like, alternate idea of Elden Ring sort of thing, I would like it if we didn't have to always be killing everything. It would be interesting to work with Millennia, or to work with Moog and decide, no, I want to follow that path. I like that you can do that with Ronnie, and I like that Ronnie has a quest like that where you can follow that path. I wish that there were more options in that regard. I wish that there was a Millennia ending. I wish that there was a Mikla ending, right, where these other Empyreans can ascend to godhood and that you could follow them. I think that would have been really interesting. But I mean, that's not the game that they're making. So, those are some of my thoughts on the lore. So, final concluding points. Overall, really liked Elden Ring. It does a lot of interesting stuff. It does some stuff that I don't like. I wish the world felt less linear and more open, that there was a more sense of diverse paths. It did have really good sense of exploration on the initial playthrough, but we're looking at like, I have 6 characters right now of various progression points. 2 of them haven't really gotten outside of Limgrave much. I mean, one of them technically has, but I have 3 characters that have beaten the game. I have 1 character that's gotten pretty close. And, it's like Consecrated Snowfields area. And I wish that the sense of exploring the game didn't feel like it had such a linear drive to boss feel, that it felt that there was, again, a lot of this is world arrangement as well, that I wish that it felt like the world splayed out more, like Majora's Mask with Termina Field, and Clocktown with Lendel at the middle. But this is not the game that we have. For me, if I was sort of rating it of the Souls games that I've played, which is, again, the Dark Souls trilogy and Elden Ring, I'm not quite sure where I place it beyond above Dark Souls 3. To me, Elden Ring does everything I liked about Dark Souls 3 better, and most of the problems that I have with Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring has as well. Some of them are a little bit exacerbated, but it's kind of a mix, because boss weapons don't have a separate upgrade material, for example. It's all just Somberstone. So overall, I definitely like Elden Ring. Like, it very firmly supplants Dark Souls 3 in my mind. where it's like, do I want to replay Dark Souls 3 with Elden Ring in existence? Not really. Because Elden Ring is like better Dark Souls 3. Um, the main thing that I'd miss from Dark Souls 3 is some of the boss weapons that I thought were really cool. Is it Farron Greatsword? The one that you get from the Watchers. And then Frida's Scythe are what immediately come to mind. There are a couple of other cool ones as well. The combined sword from the Twin Princes, for example. But there's something. The Sword of Night in Shadow is kind of in the same sort of space, so whatever. Hopes for, but like in terms of like compared to Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 has some aesthetics areas that I really like with Majula. And does things that I enjoy, though I haven't revisited in quite some time. Dark Souls 1, though, is really, really hard to supplant just because I find reinforcement most interesting in Dark Souls 1, and I find the world arrangement and exploration, even on repeat playthroughs, the routing is much more interesting in Dark Souls 1 for me than it is in Dark Souls 2, and especially Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring have a similar sense of linearity and like funneled progression to me. And Elden Ring just has more of it, but it doesn't do the greater wrapping around that something like Dark Souls 1 does, which is something that I really enjoy. So Dark Souls 1 has a lot of things that make me like it a lot, and it's the one that I sort of rank as my favorite of the Dark Souls trilogy, even though I prefer the combat of Dark Souls 3. And Elden Ring, again, advances that. So there's just so many things I like in Elden Ring. It's probably it's hard to pick between them at that point. It's just like Dark Souls 3 is relegated to, okay, you're fully supplanted by Elden Ring. But Majula is just such a wonderful place. And there's so it's probably like Dark Souls 1 and Elden Ring are kind of like competing, and Dark Souls 2 is like slightly below Elden Ring probably, and then Dark Souls 3 is down below that. So, I don't know. It's a complicated sort of thing to figure out, but it's like, what experiences can I get from this game that this other game can't deliver to me? And Dark Souls 1 and 2 have things that Elden Ring can't deliver on. So anyway, I feel like I had a final thought that I kind of erased a little bit by staying on that topic. That's what happens when you stay on topic. This has been a lengthy video. A lot of things that I wanted to talk about. Hopefully now that I've gotten all those ideas out of my head, I am done for a while. Anybody who's managed to stick through this whole thing, congratulations. I thank you for staying with it. Your opinions will probably differ from mine in a lot of different spots. Be curious to hear them and where they're at and how you feel about things. But for now, thank you all very much for listening. I'm sure I forgot some stuff. There might be more videos. If you have anything you'd like me to dig deeper on or go into more or whatever, let me know, and I can always potentially make another video. But for now, take care, everyone, and goodbye.